Hi, everybody. Happy to be here in the seat. I was thinking of how to go about this because some of the people in this room are very much familiar with Manipravalam, with the literature / language that I study, and with the Līlātilakam, the book that I'll talk about. Some of them have read it. And for some of you, these words, Manipravalam, Līlātilakam, are completely meaningless. So I've decided to start with a short introduction with the PowerPoint, and I'll sort of bring you gently into this world of Manipravalam. And then we will move to the handout and we'll read actual text. And I've prepared quite a lot of it. I hope we have time to do it all. So to be, just for a start to locate ourselves, we're talking about Kerala. Often when the word Manipravalam is heard, people assume that we're talking about Tamil Manipravalam, but I'm working on Manipravalam from Kerala, and you can see it's this green, sort of long stretch of land in the southwestern tip of the Indian Peninsula, and you can see it more clearly in this very up-to-date map of South India in purple. And when speaking about Kerala, I like saying that it has two general frontiers. One frontier goes inland, mostly to the Tamil area that has very long historical connections with Kerala. And according to Kerala historians, up until roughly the 9th century, Kerala is sort of seen as part of the Tamil land. It might be one of the regions of the Tamil land with its own ruling dynasty, but there's no indication of a different language. For example, even though I assume that people were speaking some sort of a Proto-Malayalam, but we just don't have any inscriptions or text to tell us that. And in the 9th century, we start seeing different inscriptional language. Something new is happening. And so we have this relation with the Tamil land, but not only with the Tamil land. I also want you to see Karnataka above Kerala, where Kannada is spoken, and Andhra Pradesh, or today Telangana and Andhra, where Telugu is spoken. And this map, which is called like the map of South India, is also like a rough map of the Dravidian area. And we will talk about all these languages that we will discuss today are Dravidian languages. And some people don't know, but Līlātilakam is actually the first book to relate to these families as belonging in one group. Okay, he thinks that the Dravidian languages are only the languages of Chola, Pandya, and Kerala, and not of Kannada and Telugu, but he does mention a different claim by someone else saying that they are part of the language. So this is an important thing. It's like a small detail that is nice to say about Līlātilakam. So we have this inner look, and we also have the look outside to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Sea, and Kerala is a really important place, a stop in the network of trade by Arabian traders. And we have ships going in and out, taking out spices, bringing merchandise like horses into India. We also have very ancient communities of traders, Jewish, Muslim, Christian. And so it is also a very interesting place for research in that respect. I won't talk about it, but it's like, I see it as so there are these two directions and they meet in Kerala, the outside and the inland and the out. Okay. It's also a very beautiful place and worth a visit for those of you who somehow did not go to Kerala yet. Okay, so I will talk about language today. So, and I said that roughly beginning from the 9th century, we have inscriptional language, and it would be what Sheldon Pollock in this book, The Language of the Gods in the World of Man, would call documentary language. And it takes some more time, roughly in the 13th or 14th century, when we start having local literature that is not in Sanskrit. And when I say that is not in Sanskrit, is because there is a lot of Sanskrit before that. And Kerala is really important, I think, for Sanskrit scholarship in terms of Sanskrit sciences. Kerala math is super important, astronomy. There are a lot of commentaries written in Kerala to texts that are both from Kerala and outside of Kerala, and a lot of manuscripts. It's one of the most important places where manuscripts were preserved. And I think, you know, there's this huge discussion about Sanskrit and Tamil, Sanskrit and the South. In Kerala, this whole thing is less pronounced. There is no anxiety or maybe very little anxiety about Sanskrit. And we see it from the very beginning. And I think Sanskrit scholars, like mostly Brahmins, but also other communities, they own Sanskrit just as much as people in, I don't know, in Varanasi own Sanskrit. It's their language, and they don't feel any need to sort of explain why it is so central for them. And I also wanted to bring this book, like Pollock's book, because I think in Itzik's talk, the first talk that we heard when he was speaking about Latin and Romance, and he was saying about, about the gap between having spoken language and then having written language. This is something that Pollock would say is very normative, and it takes time for a language to become first literized, so written, and then literarized, so made into literature. Okay, so we have Sanskrit, and then around the 13th century, we start seeing local literature, and it's not like everything is in the same genre, or we have different things, but the majority of the texts that we meet are written in this thing. Sometimes it's easy to talk about it as a language, sometimes as a literary style, and it is called Mani Pravalam. Literally, Mani Pravalam means gem coral. Okay, so Mani means gem. It is either a name for a generic gem, or sometimes it can be translated as a ruby, or I think a pearl. Pravalam is a coral. And just as this necklace that you see in front of you is made of two different gems that are different in color or in texture, but they also come to create a very beautiful and unified object, in the same way a verse or a poem in Mani Pravalam is borrowing from two lexical, I don't know, like reservoirs. But the thing that is created is it's supposed to be, the ethos of Mani Pravalam is its unity. Okay, it's supposed to be, you're not supposed to read it and feel, oh, Sanskrit, Kerala language, Sanskrit. It has to be beautiful. And Līlātilakam, the text that I will talk about today, actually says that the gem, the Mani, must be understood as a ruby. So that both gems have to be red. So it goes even further in saying, okay, it's the same color. They have to be in the same color and of a different texture. Now, I think for some of you here, and probably everyone doing other Indian languages, that this idea of having Sanskrit and a local language meeting is not very unique, because actually in all other, it's the basic thing for Indian languages. They always have Sanskrit lexicon. So what is so unique about this thing? Why are we talking about this combination here? So first of all, it's true. It's probably hard to find an Indian language that has no Sanskrit in it, even Tama. But there are some unique aspects in Mani Pravalam, and I'd like to sort of take a moment with them. So here you can see the ruby anagram. So first of all, in Mani Pravalam from Kerala, poets are implementing all kinds of Sanskrit forms as is, and this is a mandatory thing. Mani Pravalam has to include Sanskrit words, and these words can include Sanskrit case endings and Sanskrit inflected verbs. We can see, like, when I use the word Malayalam, it's a bit anachronistic because the language of Kerala was not called Malayalam at the time, but sometimes I use it to forget it. So we can see Malayalam words with Sanskrit case endings, and we can see the opposite. We can see all kinds of combination. It's not that everything goes. The whole book is written to explain how to properly merge Sanskrit into Kerala language, but there is no law saying you should not use these words or those words or these forms and those forms. So this is one thing, and this is unique. I don't think we see it in other Indian local literatures. And the second thing is that in Kerala, Mani Pravalam is an emic term, and so Mani Pravalam poets know that they're writing Mani Pravalam. They call their style or their creations Mani Pravalam, and they are aware of it, and they're playing with it. And this is something quite unique, because when you read it, you feel that they are aware of it. And I think so. The term Mani Pravalam does not come from Kerala. we have it in the Viracholiam, which is a Buddhist Tamil grammar from, I think, the 11th century, and we have it in Abhinavagupta, roughly, so a little bit earlier maybe. In Sanskrit, in Kashmir, people were using the term, but we have no other extant corpus of a large corpus of texts that call themselves Manipravalam, and even Tamil Manipravalam might include some references to this metaphor Manipravalam, but as at least from what I read, that the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas, okay, so Tamil Manipravalam is a corpus of text, of commentarial text in Tamil written by Sri Vaishnavas. So the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas don't call their text Manipravalam. This is more of a modern name terminology that is given. So this is also quite unique. And the last thing, which is not very relevant for us today, but it is relevant for other parts of my work, is that unlike many other literatures that start, local literatures in India that start with mythological stories from Ramayana, Mahabharata, the first poem in Manipravalam are mostly about local women. Okay, so not Sita, not Draupadi. We have Uniyadi and Uniyachi and their courtesans, and it's about their suitors, and it's sort of, there's something different there, and I am very much interested in it, but I won't say anything else about it today. Okay, so we will be reading from Līlātilakam today. It is a treatise on the grammar and poetics of Manipravalam, and presumably a 14th century text, even though some people in the room think that it might be later, like 16th century David. Yeah. But it's very difficult to prove because we don't know almost anything about the context of composition. The author is anonymous. We have no patron mentioned. There are some kings, so most of the verses, the illustrative verses that are in the book are erotic. But when sometimes we have like a king wandering into the book, then these kings will be from Venad, from the very south of Kerala. So scholars have assumed that this is a text from South Kerala, but we don't really have any good indications about that. And more so, we don't have any pre-modern reception history. We don't know of people who read it. We don't have commentaries. We don't have reactions. And like some of the texts that were talked about here, the text is sort of lost or forgotten, not lost, just forgotten, and then rediscovered in the early 20th century, and then printed. And it was such a surprise, I think, for many people that, especially because of what it says, and you'll see it in a minute, that some scholars thought were under the impression that this whole thing is a fraud. You know, someone wrote it in the 20th century, but I am not aware of any like serious Manipravalam scholar who believes this like fraud theory, and also there aren't any evidences for that. So I'm throwing it to the air, but it's not something I think. I also don't think that it's something that someone wrote in modernity. Okay. It is a Sanskrit book. This is important to say. And when I say it is a Sanskrit book, it's not only written in Sanskrit, it totally and happily embraces Sanskrit paradigms and categories. It doesn't try to invent a new theory, a new poetic theory, but because its object is not Sanskrit, it has to do some things differently. And so the book has 8 chapters. The first 3 chapters are doing things differently. So we have the first chapter with the definition of Manipravalam, and that's the chapter that we're going to read from today. And then a very long discussion of what Manipravalam is and is not, built as a dialogue between an opponent and a discussant. And the opponent is probably this imaginary opponent that, you know, the author is writing in order to orchestrate the discussion. And then we have also a typology of Manipravalam from best to worst. The second chapter is about the body of Manipravalam, so the words, the different Sanskrit words, the different Kerala language words that should be used in Manipravalam. And then we also have like a grammatical part. So there's a short, you know, it doesn't cover almost anything, but there's a short discussion about case, number, gender, stuff like that. And then we have a chapter about Sandhi, the 3rd chapter, and beginning from the 4th to the 8th chapters, these are the poetic chapters. We have, and they work like Sanskrit poetics. So we have a chapter about poetic flaws, doshas, We have a chapter about poetic virtues, gunas, and then there's a chapter about sound ornaments, shabdalankara, sense ornaments, arthalankara, and poetic sentiment, rasa. And I think it's an interesting thing that today in modernity, there's this modern reworking of the text, looking at the first 3 chapters as the interesting chapter. And this is a little bit like the Afodi case. So the first 3 chapters are interesting because they're saying something new and they're talking about Kerala language and they're giving this first grammar of Kerala language. And the poetic chapters are not interesting and they're not important, so much so that when you go to a Kerala bookshop today, and if you want to buy a book, a copy of Līlātilakam, which you probably won't be able to do because they're not interested in it anymore. But if you do find an edition, then it would be this like short edition with only the first 3 chapters. And I think so when I talk about Līlātilakam, I often try to give all my examples from the poetic chapters because I think they're super important. And I think like the beginning is really building up to these chapters. But today I'm not going to, sorry, because I'm contradicting myself. It's a book full of contradictions, so I'm contradicting myself a lot. But yeah, the discussion about loan words seemed really relevant to this group. So I am doing something unethical for you. Yeah.
Blame it on us.
Yeah, I'm blaming it on you. I just did it. Okay, so we have these 8 chapters, and these chapters contain over 200 illustrated verses in Manipravalam. And so it's actually the first Manipravalam anthology, which is a really important thing. Andrew Ollett termed in his book, so he spoke in his book about Prakrit, he coined this term accidental anthology. So often in these books of poetics, they're doing poetics, but since they're giving all these examples, then they become anthologies. So the Līlātilakam is sort of an accidental anthology, but I'm not sure how accidental it is. I think it's also a really important part of the project to show that Manipravalam can do all these things. And even when you talk about poetic flaws, then he will still choose the most beautiful verses to make his point. Okay, so up until yesterday, I thought that we will go to the handout at this moment, but I spoke, I think it was to Pat, and I realized that it would be a crime to talk about Manipravalam and not to show you even one verse in Manipravalam. And I think David, it is in your spirit.
Yeah.
You would have been. Yeah. So as a David student, I will now show you a verse in Manipravalam. I sort of randomly chose it, not really randomly, from the Līlātilakam. It is taken from the 4th chapter, the chapter of doshas. And this verse actually is according to the author, a flawed verse, because according to Sanskrit poetics, when describing love has to be neutral. So you can describe, and poets often describe fighting couples, but it's fine if there is hope of union. But if there's no hope, if it's completely like it's unrequited love, hopeless love, then it cannot be good erotic poetry. This is Sanskrit poetics, and the Līlātilakam author agrees. So he gives this verse as an illustration to a flawed verse because it describes unrequited love. I'll first read it in Manipravalam. I'm sorry that I'm not reciting. It's in a sort of, only after preparing this, I realized that I chose something in a very uncommon meter that I don't know how to recite, Praharshini. Sorry, so I'll just read it. And it says, Pandelam Paravanita Kathantaram Yan Mindola Viraha Bhayena Kantayod Innelam Parimala Gatramanyal Kandal Mindal Inna Ida Mama Chetaso Vishadaha. And in English, once I wouldn't tell my love of other women I had spoken to, afraid she'd simply leave. Now, even when she sees a hint of turmeric smeared on my body after touching all those fragrant bodies, she says nothing. This breaks my heart. So just to say a couple of things about the verse. So we have this situation where we have this Mindola. I didn't speak. I didn't say anything about other women because I was afraid she would just leave me. But now she doesn't speak. Mindal, she says nothing because she doesn't care, even if she sees me. So women would use this turmeric paste or sandalwood paste on their breasts mostly. If he's coming home with turmeric or sandalwood on him, it means that he had sex with other women, but she doesn't care. So, and this is what breaks his heart. So this is a flawed Manipravalam verse. Huh?
So bad.
It's never bad. It's never bad. It's the flawed verses are the best.
Yeah.
But it is not. It's I don't know. So now I want to show you how the technical things. So I colored in blue, another unethical thing. I colored in blue the Sanskrit. I want you to see. I'm saying unethical because I think you shouldn't pay attention to the contours of the two languages. It should be unified, but I will paint in blue now the Sanskrit words. So we have pande once, elam, all, paravanita kathantaram, all these talks with or about other women. This is in Sanskrit. Okay, Nyan, I, Mendola. So he brings this, I think it's, I don't know, accusative or I didn't say anything about other women. This just comes. This is a compound that just is included in this way. Then we have viraha bhayena. Why didn't I say anything about other women? Because I was afraid. Bhaya means fear of viraha, of separation. So we have this compound with two words. Both of them are from Sanskrit, and bhaya, the word for fear, is in the instrumental case. So we have instrumental Sanskrit in the verse. Okay, and then we have another interesting thing. He didn't say anything to his love, Kanta, and Kanta, again, this is sort of, you can argue about it, but it is a Sanskrit word. It's definitely a Sanskrit word, but it's also a word that came into Kerala language lexicon. And this Sanskrit word has the associative case. Okay, it has a Malayalam or a Kerala language case. Okay, and then we have in it today, kalam, again, all, parimala, gatra, manyal, kandal. So even if she sees, we have parimala, fragrant, gatra, body, manyal, turmeric. So here, this is a compound with three components, and one of them is in Kerala language, clearly Kerala language, not a Sanskrit word, and then two of them are in Sanskrit. Now, in other literatures from India, like Telugu or Kannada, a compound like this would be considered a hostile compound, or arisamasa or vairisamasa. It is wrong to take words like from two languages and combine them in one compound, but in Manipravaram, it's completely fine. There's no problem with it whatsoever, and we see many examples. And then we have this small like a little sentence at the end, and he said, so Mindal, she doesn't say anything, and Enne is like iti. It says here it means because, and because of that, either this again in Kerala language, mama chetaso vishadaha. So there is this vishada, this in the nominative, marked in the nominative, this sorrow of my heart. Mama means my in Sanskrit, and chetas here is in the genitive case. So you see that the blend is goes really deep. It's also important for me to say that this is just one example. There are different examples, and you can have verses with Sanskrit verbs. You have verses with a lot of Sanskrit. You have verses with a lot of Kerala language. According to the author of Līlātilakam, you should have more Kerala language, and it should feel like a treatise in Kerala language. Okay, it shouldn't feel like some corrupt kind of Sanskrit with some Kerala language words here and there. But if we look at Manipravalam literature after Līlātilakam, we see a lot of Sanskrit. This dictum is completely, I don't know who read Līlātilakam, but even if they read it, they didn't pay attention. And we can see full verses in Sanskrit that David would say are actually in Manipravalam and not in Sanskrit, because
in Malayalam.
In Malayalam, yeah, because the context makes them into something else. And so, but again, I wanted you to know what we're talking about when we're going into this theoretical discussion about loaning words. Okay, so a few terms before we start reading. I will be using the term pasha, and pasha means language. I sometimes translate it as language or the language, and sometimes following Igal and Charlie as our language, because a person can be living in Indonesia or in Kerala, and they can say pasha, and it would mean not the same thing objectively, but the same thing subjectively. It would mean their language. It could be other languages. So, and sometimes when pasha is in the plural, I will translate it as words, which I think might be not very common in Sanskrit, but it is clearly the case in the Līlātilakam. Okay, The author will often use the terms Chola and Pandya. There are these two Tamil dynasties ruling in different parts of Tamil Nadu, but when he uses it, he uses it as sort of like synchronically. He doesn't like using the term Tamil for Eastern Tamil. He would like to reserve the term Tamil, or which he says is a corrupt form of the word Dramida. He would like to use it for Chola, Pandya, and Kerala together. All of these are Tamil. And this he has to do because before him, some authors have called Kerala language Tamil. So he comes into the field with his language being called Tamil. So he will say Tamil is actually Chola, Pandya, and Kerala. And when he wants to talk about the other kind of Tamil, the Eastern Tamil, then he will call it Chola and Pandya. Now there have been some discussions about what is exactly Chola, what is exactly Pandya. It's not very clear, but it is sort of clear that when he speaks about language, about words, about people speaking, he will refer to Chola. And when he speaks about lexicons, books, then he will usually call them Pandya. Okay, so we will see that. And because we're not beginning from the beginning of the chapter, I want to give you the definition of Manipravaram, what we are actually talking about. So his definition of Manipravaram, and this is the first aphorism of the book right at the beginning, he says, Bhasha Samskrita Yogo Manipravaram. Manipravaram is the yoga, the union or the binding together, the combination of Bhasha and Samskrita in Sanskrit. And immediately after that, in the self commentary, which is also in Sanskrit, he would say, when I am saying Bhasha, I only mean Kerala Bhasha. I am not talking about different kinds of combinations. I am only talking, for me, Manipravaram is the combination of Kerala Bhasha and Sanskrit. There might be other combinations, but they have other names. So Manipravaram is just the combination of Kerala Bhasha and Sanskrit. And so this is where we leave the, this is where we turn to our handout. And so there's a whole discussion built around this aphorism. And now the discussion is going to be somewhat political, but I want you to remember that the general structure is like Shastra, it's science, and what the opponent is trying to do here is first and foremost to refute the definition. So there are political meanings to it, but we are in this scientific thing, and he's trying to, like, the main aim is to refute the aphorism, and this has a lot of that is at stake. Some of it is political, some of it is poetic, and I will talk about it at the end. Okay, so just to see. Okay, so the opponent says, oh, and by the way, Naresh here did a lot of the transliteration, so I want to thank you for that, as well as Whitney Koff. But the translations are mine, so if anyone has suggestions about better translations, this is why I included the Sanskrit, free labor of people correcting my translations, and nothing is translated, by the way, from Manipravaram. None of the poems. There's one like Bhakti poem, which is so unusual in Manipravaram, that is translated, but none of the is translated.
Which one is it?
Puntanam. Okay, so the opponent says, wait a minute, this definition, Bhasha Samskrita Yogo Manipravaram, demands some further consideration. You said that when using the term the language, Bhasha, you only mean Kerala language and no other languages. Moreover, to this language, so to Kerala language too, no other language could be connected apart from Sanskrit because of the difference from Sanskrit. So in other words, you said that it can be only Kerala language and it could be only Sanskrit, that Manipravaram is made from only these two things. You clearly said that Manipravaram is the union of Kerala language and Sanskrit. Yet this definition seems improper, since in Manipravaram there is also Chola language. For example, Kundal, Kural, and Konga. And the word Kundal will repeat itself. It means hair. These are all Chola words. So why is he saying this? He's saying this because it is true. People in Kerala, I guess in the 14th century, when they were talking about their hair, they did not use the term Kundal, but it is found in poetry. And I guess that in Tamil, it was still used. It was also part of spoken language. So the opponent here says, wait a minute, there's something wrong. You shouldn't say it is Kerala Pasha Samskrita Yoga Manipravan, because actually there's Chola in it. So our discussant, or the leading voice, answers, only these. There are a million Chola words that should be mentioned, like Mula, Tala, Kal, Pon, Pendila, Tala, Tinapana, etc. And these are words that are in use in the spoken, I think most of them at least the first ones, they were definitely in use in spoken Kerala language, okay? So if this is not enough, one should also mention the existence of Kannada words. Remember Karnataka right above Kerala. So we have also words from Karnataka, from Kannada, like Ana, Al, Allah, Eli, Ade, Adu, and of Andhra language, meaning Telugu, like Udal, and of Kudanata language. And this is probably Kudaga, which is another Dravidian language, like Achan and Thala. So there are all these words that are also found in other languages. So if you're saying, why are you only talking about these words, Kundal, Kural, and Konga? Like and even if your great failure of a proof is valid, are you implying that the languages of Chola, of the Cholas, Karnadas, Andhras, etc., all exist only in Kerala language? So is it like this sort of situation where things only go like this, things only go one way? So you can find words from other languages in Kerala language. The border is completely open to that way. But in Chola language, then you have to admit that all languages have words from other languages. Why are you not saying that in Kannada language and in its literary text, there exists Chola language? So you can find Chola language or Tamil in Kannada. Then you should also admit that in literary texts in Chola language, Kerala language exists. So you can also find Kerala language in Chola language, in Tamil, as well as in texts in Kannada language, etc. Moreover, in Sanskrit, and this is here going into like serious territory, in Sanskrit there is Prakrit, okay? Mani, Rama, Viraha, Moha, etc. So all these words, including the word Rama, which is God, Lord Rama, you could say that they're Prakrit. Why? Because they're spelled exactly the same way in Prakrit and in Sanskrit. Some words, when they shift between, some lexical, when some words enter the lexicon of another words, there are some phonological changes, but some words do not need any phonological change. So would you say that a word like Mani, Rama, Viraha, and Mo are actually Prakrit words in Sanskrit? That would be a really problematic thing to say about Sanskrit as a language that is anadi, has no beginning. Blah, blah, blah. And one should say that in Prakrit there exists Sanskrit. In Sanskrit poems like Raghuvamsha, and Raghuvamsha is one of the most famous poems in the entire Sanskrit canon written by the poet Kalidasa. So in the Raghuvamsha, there exists Chola language. Why don't you say that? See words like Kalpana, Kama, Kanaka, Kamala, Kala, Vanita. So this is an interesting thing, and I won't take the time to go over every word, but we might say that some of these words are Dravidian, but I don't think this is his point. His point here is that some words to shift from Sanskrit to Tamil or vice versa change, but these words, because of the way Tamil is built and Sanskrit is built, they remain the same. There's no phonological difference between the way you or say Kalpana in Sanskrit or in Tamil, or maybe not a large one. And in Prakrit poems as well, there exists Chola language, and the same thing, you can play the same trick, or like find similar words that in Prakrit that are actually Chola, like Aravinda, Makaranda, Taranga, Kanka, etc. This way, there would be no fixed regional language, no fixed text, and no fixed region. Okay, and I want to read this in Sanskrit. Evamcha niyata kachit desha bhasha cha niyata kashchit bhasha prabandhascha deshascha na syat. This is a really big statement. So if you allow, if you view these words as belonging in other languages, then you've completely like breached the system. Sanskrit would be apabhramsha, which is a name of a language, but it also means like the corrupt language, and apabhramsha would be Sanskrit. That is quite wrong. Okay, and then he continues. Great scholar. And in one of the editions, he also says Manipravalam poet, meaning that maybe the opponent is a Manipravalam poet, which is interesting. This idea of yours is not very appealing. Look, all these regional words are individually definite. Okay, and the same goes for Sanskrit, etc. I think by etc. he means prophet. Okay, so this is still the Siddhanta, yeah. Sorry. So yet some words, and this is where we get to this theory of semblance, some words resemble other words, just like people do. And your argument concerning these words is improper. Only this argument concerning semblance is proper. And here I skipped on some parts where he gave very complicated Sanskrit examples with like Gayal and Gao and stuff that I would have to explain for too long. But I think I've included it in the Sanskrit. Words like kunda, etc., resemble Chola words, but they are not Chola words. And this is a big difference because it can sound the same. It can be maybe written in the same way. It doesn't, I don't know, writing is maybe not that important here, but it doesn't mean that they are Chola words. And the same goes for words like udal, which are not Andhra words. They just resemble Andhra words. Likewise, nale, ila, etc. are not Kannada words. They just resemble Kannada words. And then he goes on and he says, there may still be some doubt regarding this semblance. Why did you determine that these words are Chola language or Chola words? If it is because they're not found in the Kerala's common speech, and this is an important term that he uses. He says he uses the term samanya vyavahara. So he will talk about two parts of language: samanya vyavahara, which is common or ordinary or everyday speech, and vishesha vyavahara, the specialized speech or literature, in other words. So languages that have literature have these two parts of language. There is always samanya vyavahara and there is vishesha vyavahara. So why are you saying that these words are Chola words? If you're saying it because they are not found in the common speech of the Keralans, in the samanya vyavahara, why are you so sure that they are Chola words? Okay, so again, you're assuming this thing, and we should, there is this very clear, I think, like thing in the background that Tamil is this language with this long history and text and a tradition, and this language, Kerala language, is, I don't know, finding its first steps. So it has to sort of prove itself. But comes the question, why are you saying that if it's not found in the ordinary speak, why would it be Chola words? Just a second. Why are you so certain? Can't they be Kannada words or Andhra words? So if this thing is open, then why strictly Chola? This could be Kannada or Andhra, because some words appear in these, some words are shared between these languages. If you claim that, due to the difference from Kerala language, there exist some other languages in Manipravalam, that would be quite foolish because of not considering the specialized speech. So if you're only talking about spoken language and not about literature, then this is quite foolish because literature is part of language. Is it said because these words are not found in the common speech of the Keralans? Is finding them in the specialized speech not enough? Specialized speech is also speech. And thus, Manipravalam is clearly a speech of the Keralans. So Manipravalam is our Vishesha Vyavahara. It's our speech. And if you find a word like Hunda in Manipravalam, that would be enough to say that it is part of Kerala language, because Manipravalam is part of Kerala language. Again, and this sort of goes back to the way it should feel like. It should have the impression or the pratiti of being like Kerala language. It shouldn't feel like some corrupt Sanskrit. And there, words like Kundal, etc., are found. Moreover, are you determining the cholaness of all these words that appear in the specialized speech, or only of words like kundal, etc., because they do not appear in the common speech? So it's a little bit confusing, but he's asking, so are you saying that, so it's not that only kundal is used in Tamil, there are other words that are used in Tamil as well. So are you saying that all these words are chola? Everything that is found in Chola language is chola, or only the words that are not used in Kerala language? So the first possibility, everything is wrong, since you said that there is also Chola language in Manipravalam. So you didn't claim that Kerala language, that everything in Kerala language is Chola language. So it's your problem. You could have claimed, but you didn't. So this first possibility is wrong. Regarding the second possibility, it adds nothing new to what I have already mentioned. Okay, so we have this theory. I often think about it as like, I think of Sonia Gandhi. When she became Indian, she had to give up her Italian citizenship, right? She might have some like Italian things in her, but technically she's Indian. So these words, you know, we're looking at things synchronically. Diachronically is not, he's not doing diachronical stuff here. Maybe when he thinks about Sanskrit, he thinks diachronically, but when he thinks about all these desha bhashas, about all these regional languages, he thinks synchronically. This is either Kerala or Chola, and if it is found in the context, and he will.
Sorry, can I just clarify that exception for Sanskrit? So he's not saying that Manipravalam doesn't have Sanskrit in it. He's just saying it doesn't have these other languages in it.
Yeah, Manipravalam must have Sanskrit in it.
Right. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood that. So
San-
Sanskrit's an exception.
Sanskrit is of a completely different order from these desha bhashas. It is anadi. It has no beginning. It is like, I don't know. Well, we can. It's a little bit more complicated than this.
Okay,
but
that's fine. I got it now.
okay. So we continue. The opponent then says, you have admitted that there are Chola words like kundal, etc. in Manipravalam. Words such as these do appear in the ordinary speech of the Cholas. So we do use, or not we, maybe they do use words like kundal. This is the proof. See, they do appear in the specialized speech of the Keralans, yet how could you determine which language they are? Existing in the specialized speech is not essential. So the opponent here says literature is not enough. It can be like, I don't know, a loan word in literature, but it is not enough to say that a word is part of the lexicon of a language if you find it in a poem. And then the discussant says, let me answer. Why would the best defense is attack? So why would Chola words like adu, magadu, and naduri be considered Chola words? Okay, so these words, and these words are words that are part of grammatical writing in Tamil, but they're not used in daily speech, right? Okay. So words like these are considered to be Chola language, but people in the Cholas and Pandyas, they don't use these words. Or could they be seen as Kerala words? For they appear only in the specialized speech of the Cholas and Pandyas, in literary texts like Padupata or Yetatohai. And not, did I misspell Patta? Yeah, I feel like, how do you? Patupata, yes, double. And not in Chola common speech. And then the opponent says, but words like Ardu, etc., are explained in the lexicons and grammars of the Cholas and the Pandyas. That is why they're definitely Chola words. So we have here the joker. It's in the dictionary. So clearly it's a Chola word. And then the discussant says something interesting. Let me answer. You say that although these words are found only in the specialized speech and not in the ordinary speech of the Pandyas, they're Pandya words. It doesn't matter if they are found in the dictionary or not. What about it? Usage is more basic than a dictionary. And I think this is one of the things why people were suspicious of Līlātilakam. He says, Abhidhana adar api prayoga eva hi moolam. So prayoga, usage, comes before abhidhana. If the determination is by the usage in the specialized speech, why, in this case, finding these words in the specialized speech should not be effective? Again, it is enough to be found in poetry. Dictionaries are secondary to usage, and usage is part of literature as well. And then the opponent says, but even if words like ardu, etc., are seen only in literary texts, the dictionary is a measure, is a pramana to determine their cholaness. Yet the Keralans have no dictionary to determine the Keralaness of words like kundal, etc., which appear in Manipravalam. And this is also sort of like a heavy statement. And we have the dictionaries, and you don't have them, so you cannot defend your language, and you cannot say that these words are part of your language. And then he says, and this is also interesting, let me answer this. No dictionary exists even for words that appear in the ordinary or in the common speech of the Keralans, like kal, karla, mala, puli. So there's no dictionary to say that kal is leg or kala is stone. But they're found in dictionaries of the Pandyas. Okay, but they are found in these Tamil dictionaries. Therefore, should they too not be considered Kerala language, but only Pandya or Chola words? With regards to these words, if the understanding of their nature, meaning as belonging to this or that language, is because they appear in the common speech, then the kind of speech is not at all useful. So if you're only considering this like common speech or spoken language, then there's no reason to talk about Samanya and Vishesha. There's no, the typology is useless. If the affirmation is based on appearing in speech of any kind, then words like kundal, etc., should be recognized as Kerala words. Moreover, without a speech, or without speech, not a speech, without speech, what is the policy for the dictionary to determine which language is which? So dictionaries too are dependent upon usage. And then he says, Kannada language is not decided upon by a local dictionary, and neither is Andhra language. And this is actually a mistake. So maybe he was unaware that these languages, I think, had dictionaries or lexicons by that time. But he says that
perhaps he's right in saying that the identity of these languages is not determined using the dictionary, not about the presence or absence of dictionary.
Yeah. So then one can know them only by the long tradition or the parampara of speech. And speech could have a specialized nature or a common nature. In determining the itness of this or that language, the cause of it is the appearance there. And again, he would say, he would promote this idea that you cannot say that a certain word found in a Manipravalam poem is Chola just because we're not using it for speaking. And then I jumped. I mean, the discussion is pretty.
What is the appearance?
No, the fact that it exists. The occurrence, maybe. Yeah, attestation is maybe a better word. The occurrence or the attestation. Yeah, this is why maybe I used appearance, but the fact that you can find, so yeah,
See it. The fact that you can
the fact
see
that
it.
you can see it. Yeah, that's the Sanskrit term, darshanam. And then the opponent says again, and I skipped some portions. He said, but regional languages touch upon languages of bordering areas. Okay, desha bhasha, paryanta desha bhashabhir samsrijyate. So we have language meet each other. They are connection. Therefore, Agastya, etc. And Agastya is the I think like a mythological Tamil grammarian. But when saying Agastya, etc., he means the lineage of Tamil, like Tamil grammarians in the plural. So Agastya, etc. said in the Pandya language grammars that among the words of the surrounding 24 regions, so this is like the Greater Tamil land, I think, some Pandya words are considered regional words. And here he's quoting from the Tolkappiyam, which is the earliest Tamil grammar. And this is interesting because generally, if he can avoid it in the Līlātilakam, he would avoid it. He would prefer using Sanskrit treatises. But in some sections, and you know, I'm saying opponent discussing, this is the same author. This author knew his Sanskrit poetics, he knew Tamil grammar, and he was able to use both to his needs. So when talking about, I think especially in grammatical issues, Sanskrit grammar was not always useful, so he does go to Tamil grammar here and there. So here he's quoting the Tolkappiyam by saying that there are 4 kinds of words in each language, I think, or in Tamil. And these are Iyarchol, which means genuine speech, like good speech, right? And you have Tirichol, which is deviant speech. And you have Tisaichol, which is regional speech. And you have Vadachol, which is northern speech or Sanskrit. So in Tamil, there are these different kinds of words. So why wouldn't you, and this is what he said, this is in Tamil poetry. So he says, thus in Kerala language too, a Chola word could be considered a regional word. So here he goes again to Tamil theory, and he says, but there are different kinds of words in literary language. So why would you not agree that that there is Chola language inside Kerala language? So the answer is this: it is not so. And then this is another interesting thing. Languages do not enter each other. Na bhashayam bhashantaram samavishati. Language can't enter each other. For if otherwise, the system, the vyavastha, would collapse. Vyavastha vilaya prasangat. So there would be the unfortunate result of the collapse of the system, of the literary system. And this is also an important thing, the fact that he sees the system.
Could you say more about this word for system? I mean,
Maybe
is
David
there
should-
a metaphor here, or
I think it's
something that's regular?
Are you sure that Samavishati means to enter?
I'm not, maybe, what do you think?
Could we overlap?
Okay. It still works. You can still say languages do not overlap with each other because of the sama. Right?
So system is something like linguistic regularity.
I think he thinks of language as a systematic entity.
But this is not language specific. If you
Right.
understand, it means regularity in
And
general.
Regular. So it's like an analogia that we could learn from. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. No, I would hear about it. And then he says in the Pandya language grammars, when discussing regional words, the reference is to words that are just similar to regional words. Again, if it is found in the context of Tamil, then it becomes Tamil. You cannot consider it as part of a different language. The reference is to words that are just similar to regional words, not to truly regional words. With regards to words, there might be a word that is similar to words of other languages. That kind of speech is not central. So with regards to this kind of similarity, it is called secondary or metaphoric, aupacharika. I'm not completely sure I know what he means by this, but I don't know if it's, maybe if you want to say something about it, the Sanskrit is here afterwards. And then the opponent goes into he has a big thing to say. He says, but from the saying 3 Tamil Nada kings came, and this he quotes from one of the Tolkappiyam commentaries. This is just a sentence saying that there are these 3 Tamil kings that came. The 3 Tamil kings are Chera, Chola, and Pandya. Chera stands for Kerala. So there are, and all 3 of them are Tamil. So if you're saying that these 3 Tamil kings came, or there is the saying, from that saying, we gather that Keralans could also be Tamils. So Kerala language and Chola language are not different. So if you're asking yourself, why is he why is the discussion so, why is it so important that that Chola words are found in Kerala language? So first, because of refuting the definition, but also because it has a larger meaning. It means that actually these languages are not different. And it is obvious when we look at at the political situation, which one belongs in which. You can't say like Tamil is some sort of Malayalam. No one would say that, but some people would say the opposite. And then the discussant says, oh, this is irrelevant. Okay, the sentence, this 3 Tamil Nadu kings came, this is irrelevant to proclaiming that Chola language exists in Manipravalam. you should say there's only Kerala language or only Chola language. And then he says, I also call Kerala Tamil, meaning Dravidian. And this is what I told you before. So the fact that you call the fact that Tamil, that there are three kinds of Tamil is fine. And this is why I think he allows himself in some other portions to use Pandya grammars. So he does see them as relevant and authoritative because of this like larger Tamil connection, but it doesn't mean that the spoken languages are the same. He says, I also call Kerala Tamil, meaning Dravidian, meaning Dramida. And still there is a difference between the languages. Though some words are the same, only fools would mistake in saying they are one. But again, the opponent won't budge. But why don't you say that words like Kundal are common to both Kerala language and Chola language? And the answer, oh, what will you gain out of that? If you're aiming at Cholaness, if you want to prove that this is actually Chola, then no. According to the definite phonological context, which is existent as one or the other, only similarity in which the basis is differentiated is suitable. And by phonological context, I didn't bring this, but there's a long list of words. And he says, okay, so this is like a new part of the discussion talking about phonology. And he says, there is a Kerala language phonological context where, for example, there is nasal assimilation, which we will not see in Tamil. So you could, if you have a word like Kunda and you don't know if it's Kerala or Chola, then you should look at the larger parts of your text. Because if you have, I don't know, like parangal for fruit and not parangal, then and you have all these like different phonological characteristics that are related to the way a Kerala language is pronounced, and then it would be a word in Kerala language. And if the other parts of the text are like, I don't know, you don't have so nda would be Tamil, and nda when it becomes na, just double na, that would be Kerala language. So that is another way to differentiate the larger phonological context, but it can only be one. It can only be one. It can't be, the word cannot do both things at the same time. And I think this is interesting when we think about loan words in the larger context about borrowing words, about, the Western discussion about this. Like he says it cannot play in both fields.
What is the basis?
Where basis?
Which the basis is differentiated? What is the basis of the similarity?
Yeah, I just Nibandanam. How else would you, so there is, in order for something to be like something else, there has to be similarity, but there's also has to be difference, because otherwise it would be the same. I think Ruika and people like there are politicians saying, so for something to be, for your face to be like the moon, they should be both round, white, not like here, light, radiant, but they also have to, like the moon is in the sky and your face is, you're a human being. So it has to be also differentiated. Otherwise it would just mean the same. I think that's what he means here, that there is similarity is based on a difference of things.
Analogy presupposes non-identity.
There is no shared commonness, the same way that Prakrit words are sometimes similar to Sanskrit. Okay, so again, we have Prakrit words that are exactly like Sanskrit, but no one would say that this is a Sanskrit word in Prakrit. And I won't say anything about it here, but I wrote a paper about how, in order to explain Manipravalam, this author goes to discussions on Prakrit, which is I won't go there. But Prakrit is really important for thinking about Manipravalam and for theorizing it. And then I just wanted to include a different part of this chapter. Just we're done with the theory of semblance, but because we had these discussions about grammar and language, I wanted to include this little part of where we have another opponent, a new opponent. And okay, so he might have lost the battle over Kundal, but and he then goes through some other direction, and he says, someone else said, Manipravalam doesn't have a grammar. There's no lakshanam, okay, no definition. If there were one, someone would have already mentioned it. No one has. It is unheard of. So why should the undone be done? Okay, very unintuitive for modern academia. But if it would have been like a worthwhile thing, someone would have already done it. So the fact that no one did it means that no one should do it. There's no point. And then he says something really beautiful. He says, oh, such stupidity. If there is Manipravalam, why wouldn't there be grammar? Grammar is nature. Lakshanam hi swarupam. So grammar is in the nature of language. To something that exists, satas, there is an unchangeable nature. And then he says, enough of this childish argument. So it doesn't matter that Kerala language doesn't have the book artifact is completely secondary. Language, Kerala language has a grammar and it is also systematic. And I didn't bring these parts of the book, but he will go into he will try very carefully to show that this is not some assemblage of corrupt Sanskrit words, but this is a system, okay? And this is where Prakrit comes in. And so I just wrote some stuff to myself, and I'll read them just to make sure that I say everything I want to say, and then I'm done. So I want to conclude by going back to where we started, Manipravalam's definition. Okay, Pasha Samskrita Yoga Manipravalam. The discussion that we read can easily translate into a political discussion, and it is clear that not only language is at stake here. So we have this Tamil Malayalam thing. And I think this is why Līlātilakam became very interesting for modern Malayalis, because they felt like someone is sort of like claiming that, this is like a statement of independence. And this is also where I think the discussion, and anyway, like talking about borrowed, like loaning words is political in a much wider sense, and we can also see it in modern discussions on it, and Hasparmat writes about it. Yet, in my opinion, this political aspect is only a part of the large picture, and we should keep in mind that this discussion was not conducted in 20th century India, when having a language meant for some having a state, and when linguistic borders determined political borders, but several hundred years before, when Kerala's polity was fragmentary and uncentralized, and where people were multilinguistic, and we talked about that. So in order to understand the larger picture, what I mean to say is that the Līlātilakam was not written to say this. This is part of a bigger thing. And so in order to understand the larger picture, I think we need to look at the book in its entirety, again, with the poetic chapters. And remember that the larger project of this book is not proving that Kerala has its own language, but that it has its own literature, and a fine one in the Sanskrit style. This is the big thing. And in order to prove this, Manipravalam had to be firstly defined, okay? And in order to say what Manipravalam means, Kerala language had to be defined, and a grammar had to be constructed. But this is part of the bigger thing. That is why a basic grammar of Kerala language was given. And the author needed to prove, because it was indeed not a given, that this language was systematic. So we were talking about this Vyavastha, but it's not only this. He says, it's not that people can speak this way or another. Yathakatamchi. People do not just say stuff because it comes out. They have this, again, grammar is nature. There is a system, and this is something that he needed to prove about Kerala language. In this sense, the theory of semblance allows the author to guard Kerala's linguistic borders from being breached by more prestigious, better documented languages that, but synchronically are just other languages, and that is important. So after proving this, that Kerala language is indeed systematic and structured, he can move on to illustrate the beauty of its poetry. And that's what he does in the rest of the book. And yeah, I'm back.
I have so many questions and thoughts, but I'll try to keep it short. Try to phrase it. So first of all, about the structure of the text, there is a Javanese text called Chandrakirana with the exact same structure, except the third chapter, which in Java is about the meters, because except for that, the definition of the language, it does exactly the same structure as it does. It's interesting for me. And another thing is comments about the differentiation of all the passages in the text is very convincing, but I wasn't that convinced with the way he takes Sanskrit out of this discussion, as if it is, yeah, it's Santali and all that, but to which extent does it reflect the readership that took place before this text? So when people who haven't read Līlātilakam or before it was written, were reading a Manipravalam text, they're stopping and saying, "Oh, it's a Sanskrit word." How did it feel to them when you have words like in the verse hyena? Okay, so you can say that's a Sanskrit word, even though I'm not convinced still. But if you have a compound and you have a few Sanskrit words and then a Malayalam word, is it not Malayalam? How do you, because the semantic range is different, the story of the word is different. It was somehow, when it got into Malayalam, it has a new story now. So even if it sounds the same, it looks the same, it tastes the same, it's still not the same word.
I agree. And I think that for good readers of Manipravalam, like Venu, for example, I think oftentimes and actually the Līlātilakam author talks about it. He says when you choose Sanskrit words, they should be suprasiddha, so they should be well known, and they should have sukumara akshara. They should have soft syllables, very soft syllables. So you don't have, and that should be sort of harmonious. And so when you read, I think, so again for Venu or for Ulur, this doesn't matter if there's a lot of Sanskrit. It feels like Manipravalam. They don't go and say, okay, this is Sanskrit. But I think still, if you go to the other end, in Sanskrit, it's very obvious what is Sanskrit and what is not.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's still, when you have it's not as simple. It's not like, I don't know how I feel like it would be wrong to say that it's all like completely one thing, because they do take, when you have like, I don't know, Vijrimbhate, or these bombastic Sanskrit things, I think they do like using these verbs because it's nice. It gives an interesting texture. It's not about only like not noticing. It's about using it in this enticing way that is playful. And so it's not about counting, even though the Līlātilakam guy would say, how would you know if you have like too much Sanskrit? You should count the words. I'm sure it's beyond that. But I also didn't tell you everything he says about Sanskrit. So Anadi, I think it's like a tax that he has to pay the Sanskrit.
No, definitely. Like I completely agree. I've just struggled with this question myself. This is why I'm asking your opinion, because when I'm reading with Javanese people, old Javanese texts, and you have Sanskrit phrases, you have Avignamastu. For them, it's Javanese, even though they don't understand what Avignam and what Astu means. It's just like saying Mazal Tov. We say it, but we don't mean like actual Mazal Tov. It's Mazal Tov.
Yeah, but you don't have only frozen. You can have a complete Sanskrit verse. You don't have only frozen things that are grammatical. It's sort of like, it's not only stuff like, you have things that are complicated, and I think that you have to know Sanskrit to understand it. Maybe this is if you don't know Sanskrit, you cannot understand Manipravalam, even if you are. Yeah.
Let's take an example from English. Suppose you have somebody, you have two voices. Somebody says, oh, look at a word like, I don't know, similarity or collaboration or something. It's not English, right? It's some Latin thing that has come into, it's a foreign thing. One might be able to actually, in theory, conceive of an English language that doesn't have, but actually, no, it's completely impossible. Nobody feels that a word like similarity is non-English by a normal speaker, because it's part of this English linguistic world, which has its own integrity. That's what he's saying about Malayalam. You can take any Sanskrit word, be nice if it actually sounds a little soft like Malayalam might do, but it doesn't really matter because any Sanskrit word, including an inflected Sanskrit word, can have a perfectly respectable and honorable place in this Mani Prabhavam, actually in Malayalam. That's why I prefer to call it Malayalam and not Mani Prabhavam, because Mani Prabhavam is a kind of literary extraction or abstraction, perhaps, of what was spoken Malayalam speech, which is full of Sanskrit, just as Tamil speech.
I completely agree with you. I'm just saying that it was an active thing that the poets did, choosing what kind of lens. It wasn't like a completely natural thing, like I'm speaking Hebrew. They could choose the amount of Sanskrit, the kind of Sanskrit. They could choose how and where to. So it's true. It felt, I think it was, and also we should differentiate between Līlātilakam and Mani Prabhavam, because you see where it went. It went to complete, like, I don't know, a complete merger of the things, right? While Līlātilakam is a little bit more anxious about not having too much Sanskrit.
But I think Danielle said it correctly. Once you have one of these Sanskrit words, it's embedded in a Malayalam sentence or Mani Prabhavam sentence or something like that. It's a
So you're activating the theory of semblance on Sanskrit as well.
Right.
But it's calling on the story of the word user bringing, it's calling on the story of the word in Sanskrit as well as the story of the word.
Sure, that's all going to be present.
Yeah.
I don't know how to. Okay.
This sort of continuing off of the Schulman's comment. Regarding, loanwords, of course, in our modern understanding, yes, similarity and cooperation are words in English, but what at least it felt to me reading the arguments of the discussant, that it almost as if he's not arguing in the modern understanding that, oh, these are loan words, but they're so native in the language that they're also our language. It's also almost like saying, no, these are actual native words. They just happen to sound the same as the same words that sound the same and have the same meaning in the other languages, but it's just a coincidence. Is this what he's actually saying, or am I misunderstanding him?
I think not when you speak about Sanskrit, maybe, but when you speak about these Chola words,
the different
then again, he has a synchronic way of looking. It doesn't matter if you go, I don't know, like 1,000 years back, and then you find it in Tamil and or not 1,000, but and you don't have any Kerala language to attest to anything. For him, the fact that this word kundal is in Mani Prabhavam, it means that it's not a Chola word, it's a Kerala word. With Sanskrit, it's a little bit more complicated, because at least if you ask Līlātilakam, the Līlātilakam, then he would say some words have already entered the lexicon of Kerala language. Some of them were changed. So for example, Kala, the part of the moon, changes into Kala, or Sita, she changes into Sita, and then they become a part. And he calls it, I think, anyway, there's a theory about how words from Sanskrit enter. Some of them change, some of them don't change. But some of the Sanskrit words, at least according to him, are just Sanskrit words. They are not a part of. Maybe if, I mean, you wouldn't agree, but this is what he does differentiate Kerala language word and Sanskrit words.
Just as we might also say, similarity. It has a derivation and a history, and yet it's an English word.
So the modern Western way of looking at this is that we could distinguish between the acts of individuals and what's conventionalized within a given speech community, right? So it seems like what he's aiming at is this actual conventionalized language of the sort of speech community. And as individuals, we can do all sorts of stuff, right? And then what puts limitations to this is our own knowledge, what we have in our multilingual repertoire, but also what we can assume as common to our interlocutors in the speech community, right? So, for example, for some of us here, we could just move very easily back and forth, switch between English and probably a bunch of other languages, if we felt comfortable doing so. This raises the question that perhaps you said it and I missed it. Who is the relevant speech community here for this text? I mean, are they thinking in this way? I mean, the moment he said nature, I said, maybe this is really something that Western modern linguists don't like to think about, which is the nature of language.
I think the community is a community of people who have both I mean, they're well-educated, either Brahmins or some people belonging to the communities that live with Brahmins and so are very familiar with Sanskrit. So they might be multilingual and they might know other languages, but they have Sanskrit as part of they feel comfortable in both Sanskrit and in.
So the prediction is that they could use any part of the linguistic repertoire for whatever their expressive and communicative needs are.
Yeah.
Right, so-
And there are a lot of jokes in Manipravalam about it, like when there are all these like mock verses of Brahmins and the kind of language that they use. So this is sort of also playful. You can show people doing different things with language.
I want to ask you about something that you didn't speak about that struck me the most while we read Manipravalam, and I mostly read it with you, which is that, and I think there's also something that the Līlātilakam author doesn't speak about, but perhaps it's in a section we didn't read, which is that it's not just about the hybridity of bits taken from one lexicon and the other, but it's also about hybridizing morphology. And for me, this was the most striking thing, that you could take a Malayalam verb, and no, it's not another Malayalam. You take a Sanskrit verb and apply a Malayalam conjugation to it. That you take a Malayalam noun, we saw this in the Vivadam reading, you take a Dravidian name Chakki, and then you apply the instrumental case ending of Sanskrit to it. And I thought this, in a way, this was, to me, very subjectively, very striking feature of Kerala, Manipravalam, and also somewhat singular.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
think we
I
see
think
it too
I
much elsewhere. And so this in terms of, so keeping this phenomenon in mind, if we ask, so for the author of the Manipravalam, what kind of object is Manipravalam? And then by extension, what kind of object is language? So here it looks like he's not giving us just a linguistic definition of language in terms of morphological phenomena, a syllabary, but some other kind of, there is a Sanskrit, to use one of David's words, sensibility. And there's a Malayalam sensibility. And it's possible to have a Manipravalam sensibility. And like Aitan said, there's a Manipravalam community, and they don't need to define its grammar, they don't need to define its lexis, but they know it when they see it.
I completely agree. And I think he does sort of touch upon it when saying that the pratiti, sort of the impression, has to be of a Kerala Pasha, I think Prabandha, I'm not sure if so it has to feel when people, when a reader or a listener hears it, it has to feel, it doesn't have to sound, to feel to him like Sanskrit. This is not really an answer to your question, but I agree that this is what I was, when I said that words come as is, maybe it was confusing in that term, because it's not only that things come in a frozen way, it becomes like generative. It's a generative thing, and you can do a lot of things with it. And there are some examples in the Līlātilakam of like I don't know, everything, all sorts of interactions from both sides, both with verbs and with nominal phrases.
And I think the analogy you gave of the naturalized citizen is a great one. And also this fourfold classification of words. So now I think it comes perhaps from the Tamil, but so the Iyarchol would be the citizen by birth, the Tirichol would be the naturalized citizen, which means it doesn't matter what your nationality used to be earlier. Now that you're used in this language, you're a citizen of here. And then perhaps the Tisaichol is a neighbor, and the Vadachol is an interloper.
That's nice. I like it. I like it.
But the Tisaichol is perhaps not so much a neighbor as a dialectical feature, which would be natural in any language system, as we know from Kerala. There are all kinds of dialects, right? They're caste specific or region specific.
But is that what you think the Tolkappiyam meant when he said?
That's a different question.
It could mean an idiolect, it could mean a dialect, but it could also mean the lexis of an adjacent language. No?
He gives Tolkappiyam has a whole list of what he means. There's 24 regions. For their words that exist only in particular regions. There's a strong awareness of that.
I think also going back to your question, there is this tension between doing all the weird things, like still you wouldn't see in every Mani Pravalam verse, these kind of things that are, and doing the things that people, when they read them, they feel, okay. So I think the poets can play with the unusual things, but they would usually keep it, I don't think about it.
I was struck by your initial comment about the relative lack of anxiety in Mani Pravalam in general. And I mean, I was trying to think while we talk about the source of this lack of, and also like in terms of the framework of this workshop of the wars, and so it seems as if this idea of the like there's no overlap in language, as in Kundal can be Tamil Kundal and Marathi Kundal, and they don't sort of like. So it seems as if you need to have, I mean, it's a bit deceiving, this binary of the Mani Pravalam, right? Because it's not a binary, it's always 3 and more. I mean, you touched on this, I know. But it seems as if this lack of anxiety has to do with the fact that it's not a binary. It's like, I mean, here is the plural world that acknowledges its morality. It kind of allows for this self-placement that is not so anxious. I mean, I don't know, I was wondering what you think about this lack of anxiety not to place it.
I think that if you compare Malayalam to Tamil, it's less standardized. Definitely in there's no Malayalam academy sitting, and the fact that there is no grammar allows for plurality, and so there is less of a right and wrong. There are all these dialects and words there are many things happening, and I think even today when you come to Kerala, you feel this kind of, yeah, okay, they don't have this like language. I mean, Malayalam, this is also something that I'm a bit like, it's not good for people doing Malayalam studies because no one wants to study it. It's not that important. It's fine. We just speak it. It's you don't have a lot of like Malayalam. One of my teachers in Kerala once told me that there was I think like undergraduate students trying to apply to the university, Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, and she said, I am willing to study in every department, even Malayalam. It's like, we didn't accept her just because she said, even Malayalam. This is like, so, but this thing also allows, even as far as way back when Līlātilakam was written, for some, yeah, more things can and I think it's connected to all those people coming from foreign lands.
But actually, there's a lot of anxiety. This whole discussion is anxious anxiety.
In the Līlātilakam.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak about that for a second. First of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And this is maybe the 3rd or the 4th time I'm reading with you this passage. And I'm beginning to understand. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. I'm still not sure. But something crystal. And that thing is that when you go back to that first slide where you said what's unusual about the Līlātilakam is not just the unique conceptualization of Mani Pravalam, but the need to defend its existence, which you don't see, as far as I'm aware, in the old grammars, or in, more relevantly, in the 2nd millennium grammars like for poetics, like the Kaviraja Marga for Kannada, the Tandi Alankara for Dandi. Nobody has to say, yeah, we have this language. It's separate from all these other languages. Listen to me. Nobody has to make that claim. That claim, to me, reflects a kind of an anxiety that has to do with a kind of the double subordination or double kind of subaltern status of Kerala Bhasha with respect to Sanskrit and respect to Tamil.
Yeah.
And the need to say it exists, it comes back to the question of the community. So he has the verses, he has the udaharanas, he has the illustrations. but he has to, and he has no problem with Sanskrit coming in. I mean, it has to come in a certain kind of aesthetic way, but it's most welcome. But he has to prove that it exists. And that to me is extremely unusual. I cannot think, maybe there's another example, but I don't know of any other example of this sort. And that is fascinating. I mean, that I finally understood that this fascinates me about this text. I mean, I always read it and reread it. And didn't fully understand.
I think the first time when I gave such a lengthy talk about Līlātilakam was when I was invited to Pondicherry to this event on Manipravalam where I met Naresh for the first time with Eva Vilden. And there was a whole group of Tamilists in the room. And I felt like I'm saying that exactly. I had this, they still, I felt like they still didn't accept the fact that this language exists. And I feel like I'm in the right position to this is the perfect situation to talk about because it still is sort of like the situation. But when I said I think less anxiety, I meant towards Sanskrit, not towards Tamil. And I also want to say that there is more anxiety towards Sanskrit in the Līlātilakam than you would find in if you read Mara Mangala Kavi or Punam, they would very naturally take I don't know, here you have Damayanti's talking to Nala, so suddenly it will be only in Sanskrit, or they can play with it. It becomes a playful thing. There is no problem whatsoever with having Sanskrit, but in the Līlātilakam still, what you can see, and also in the earlier texts, you would usually not find a Sanskrit prose section. I'm not talking about commentary. I'm talking about literary prose. So there is a shift towards from less Sanskrit in the beginning, not to as much Sanskrit as you want in later 16th, 17th century.
I think Joseph has
Yeah.
I'll see. I hope I can say this coherently. There are interesting contrasts here with the Eiffel, Maseiffel. And Maseiffel is like this, is very much concerned with purity of language versus intermixed languages, right, that contain known words from other languages, and so on. And I always thought that the emphasis on purity or oneness, right, had theological content. It had a theological source. So you find, in the Arabic Arabiya, this, attempt to get pure Arabic, right, that carries over into the Hebrew poetry, attempt to purify the Hebrew, okay. But I wasn't quite sure whether that's really the issue. And what you're suggesting here, okay, if I understood you, is that you can't be a language if you don't have a literature, okay? It's sort of like the anxieties over, it's like literature envy, right, in languages, okay? You can't have a language unless you have a literature, but then the literature has to be unique or specific to that language, which means that the language itself has to be determined by its own nature or its grammar, okay, which is a type of entirely internal regularity and systematicity. And if that's right, then what the grammar generates, in a sense, is not, like for Ethodi yesterday, the written Torah was the corpus of linguistic data, sentences, right? But if you read that in light of this, all right, the written Torah is a piece of literature, not a body of linguistic data, okay? And I wonder whether or not that idea of, so Hebrew is a language, biblical Hebrew is a real language, a true language, because it has a literature, okay? And the New Testament isn't really a literature because it's generated by these languages that are not pure, that don't have this type of internal systematicity. So that would be a really very different kind of argument, right? So anyhow, that I'm throwing that out as whether you see some sort of similarity here.
It's really interesting because I think the person writing it had these theories, very well constructed theories made for Sanskrit, but it was sort of, it needed proof to even be able to use them, because exactly like Yigal said, he needed to prove that this is, that this is, while Sanskrit is a pure language, and at least, I mean, this is complicated, but Sanskrit is from a different order, maybe from these, and so to even use these things on Kerala language demanded some avodat hachana, some, you know, demands some explanation, some groundwork. And so I think he would, yeah, I need to think. This is really interesting. I just don't know.
I mean, maybe a difference, you know, in culture, value, and literature. You know, simply text as pieces of literature or bodies or linguistics, you know.
The thing is that I think all this discussion is, like I said, I know like you imply, it is created for literature. There's no need to go through all this like proving that we have a language and all that, but as you said, literature makes our language what it is, and therefore it is worthwhile to sort of go to the battle.
Say that it was Malayalam was a literature, was a literary corpus without the language.
At least they didn't know that it was a language.
Yeah.
They were speaking Malayalam for centuries without realizing.
And also when we look at Malayalam today, it is so much influenced from its literature.
We'll take one more question and but briefly, and then we'll stop for a bit.
So I have a question regarding what the author says, that languages do not enter into each other. There would be a layer of this and that, the way of complementarity. And so he's not seeing this problem with using two different grammar systems, I think. I mean, I'm not sure how the grammar systems are working for Malayalam. So he doesn't see this collapse happening of two different grammars entering and working together in a words.
Right.
That is somehow okay, but it's the borrowing of the words. And I mean, I find this
Maybe this is also, but again, there is a difference between Sanskrit and its relation to all these Desha Bhashas, which is sort of like this inherent, it's like a, you know, I don't know if mother language is, but Sanskrit exists in them inherently. It doesn't have to come inside, maybe, because it is always there. It has always been there, and they were, but so that is a different relation. But saying that that Chola and Kerala are the same, that is a different thing. So that is of a, so it's like this is fine, but this is not fine. I think I hope I answered, but it's true. It's because he only talks about how to mix it well.
I wish we could have invited the author of the Līlātilakam. When he says Nahi bhashayam bhashantaram samavishati, one can disprove this, and especially for Sanskrit. Every play in Sanskrit has at least two kinds of prakrit embedded in it.
Yes.
And
But that's not bhasha.
Yeah, Bhasha is.
And it's also Samavesha. And I would debate you, Yigal. I invite the author of the Līlātilakam.
I invited him, but he couldn't be so. Right, thank you so much. What century was it?
כן, תודה רבה. אנחנו צריכות לדון. זה נורא קשור, אני חושבת דרך אגב שהמבנה הוא תמילי, דוד, נכון? דוד, המבנה הזה של גם דקדוק וגם פואטיקה, זה מבנה של תמילי, נכון?
גם דקדוק
וגם פואטיקה, באותו ספר. זה מבנה.
תמיד טוענים שהחלק הפואטי הוא לא לגמרי. טוענים שזה קצת יותר נצחה אולי מהחלק הפואטי. קשה לדעת, אבל היום זה ספר אחד. עכשיו בספר הפואטיקה זה החלק השלישי, אולי החשוב יותר להגיד את זה. כי זה אני מתעסק בכל דווקא. אני שמעתי
ויש שם חלק ענק משפטי,
משהו דומה. כן, אני חושב לקרוא את זה, זה ברור, זה נראה לי משהו אנלוגי קצת.
יכול מאוד להיות, אני חושב
כן נעשה כלל, אקסיומה. ברגע שיש איזשהו שינוי במפה האקולוגיה של הג'אנרים, של השיפוט והתחומים האקספרסיביים, ברגע שיש שינוי מהותי, אולי בפרש 100 שנה, בסוף הגיע איזושהי, זה בא ביחד. יש קודם כל למצוא את הדרך האלה בתחומים האקספרסיביים עצמם, אבל יש אחרי זה גם דווקא בזה לעשות תיאורטיזציה של מסעות, לסדר את הכללים שלה, תמיד יש את זה, זה מה שיש לנו, אנחנו רואים את זה בפרויקט של ה-ERC, כל פעם את הדבר הזה, אני לא יודע אם זה דבר אוניברסלי, אבל בהודו זה כן, תמיד יש את זה. בג'אמית אין לנו ביקור, זה רחוק יותר מפה, זה קצת יותר רחוק, אפילו הרבה יותר רחוק. וחוץ מזה זה בג'אפ, זה בתוך המטריצה התרבותית הזאת של נכון, אבל בכל זאת, אולי היה ביקור בעבד, אני יודע, הרי יש משהו ככה, הם לקחו אולי את הקוויה הכי מדוקדקת שיש, זה יצירת יסוד בג'אפ, אולי שם משהו.
בהתחלה לחדור אני רואה
זה עולם בנוי אחרת, עם איזשהו היגיון, אני לא מבין את זה, אבל אני רואה שזה שם, לא, תבין את זה, את אני לא יודע, בעצם הש"ס, המושג של הש"ס, הרי זה עולם טנטרי, זה נראה גם הסנסקריט, בתוך זה יש את המדעים למיניהם, כולל הגרסה הג'אפית הזאת של המאגיה של העברות, כולל הצורות הגרפיות.
Yeah, exactly. So and she is good and she worked with Suganya and things like that. So these are the options that I know of. But if you have more specific questions, like people want to or you need to be in contact with anyone,
Let me write it to you. So, but there is a weird H.
You're feeling okay so far? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Just, oh wait, there is a footnote.
Thank you.
Oh,
I feel like
My name and my
ever
family
since
name,
breakfast today, you're kind of self-conscious that I'm the
Yeah.
only one in a t-shirt behind.
Okay, yeah, just, yeah. Great.
You know, for the fancy dinner tomorrow, but maybe I should have
Yeah,
one for
I
every
know,
day.
that's very nice.
You guys should have brought-
No, I think you're good. I think you're good. As long as you're more fun than the rest of us, so that's a prize.
Today, next 5 days. Then you have to get a test. You need to get a negative test. Or actually, the near passage.
As someone who actually doesn't know the answer, I was curious. Here, in here, is this word here, like the K, the verb? Oh, that's, because I was thinking, oh, because I was thinking, like, I thought, this may be like, from like, you know, the Latin, venue of it. Yeah, maybe I found a consonant, it's something like that. But the rest of it is like the text that you sent, just this quote. Okay, I guess that explains why I was able to find something for 3. Right. Well.
So Gary. Let's say 7 minutes, okay? And then you can just take your time and take your time.
Actually, if they come back here.
Yeah. So you have my number.
Yeah, although I never know what's gonna work with us because I don't know. Not in the building.
Right, but the county can come.
Well, I can call you if I need to. I just may need to call your cell phone. And everything. I don't have something. I don't think it's. Oh, you only have. Except for, I get like 7 messages a day.
How's your daughter? She does the-
Yeah.
Yeah, so bring the kids here. Okay. Have a good time?
Well, it turned out that we did what we needed to do, which was to rest up and get rehydrated. I discovered I was having trouble with dehydration. So, it's a good thing we didn't go on the trip. I'm sorry to you some anxiety before we figured that out. You enjoyed it, Joe?
Yeah, it was fun, but it wasn't a good trip to be on once dehydrated.
Yeah.
There was a lot of
sun.
sun.
Yeah. So it's good that we.
More system. Yeah. TA stuff.
Oh, right.
Last class and grade final assignment, which I'm very sure if I need to grade it on Monday or next Monday, but I didn't start. Yeah, I mean it's only 12 papers. Could have been worse, but yeah, but bad instructions and how to write it. And they realize it's too late now. I'm kind of writing readings. So how was trip? Where did you go with that?
City council.
Since I'm so primitive,
I think I printed it out.
We always have muscles. I'm trying to get into the 19th century.
You want to sit here, Charlie?
No, I don't think it's-
No, because of the, oh, the board. Okay. Ja, źle.
How long is the?
Heel is de loer.
15,
Are we supposed to start at 13?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Am I supposed to just go? Yeah.
Yeah.
You just share internal emotion. I had this a few moments ago to Sivan talking about the discomfort of someone who is working on Malayalam in a room filled with people who are advocates of Tamil. Since I'm used to someone who is working in Sri Lanka, I'm speaking about Sinhala. If there's more than one Tamilist in the room, I usually feel uncomfortable. Expecting that the conversations are going to become political very, very quickly. But my experience here in Jerusalem is that the Tamilists here save their rancor for other issues in the country. And they don't have, so that's why I like speaking about similar things in Jerusalem, where
other times I'm a little bit on edge about what kind of reaction. So some of you may recall that Freud in Future of an Illusion imagines that he has an opponent, quote, an opponent who follows his arguments with mistrust. Here and there, Freud allows him, what he says, allows him to interject some remarks. At one point, the opponent challenges Freud about inconsistencies between what he says in Future of an Illusion and what Freud had argued in the earlier book, Totem and Taboo. By taking in the charge of inconsistencies, a deeper and more powerful charge, that Freud was simply making things up. And he actually didn't have any evidence for any of the things that he was arguing. Freud granted his imagined opponent the right not to be convinced and said, whether or not you accept the conclusions of Totem and Taboo, I hope you will admit that a number of very remarkable, apparently disconnected facts are brought together in it into a consistent whole. Or in maybe the version that I would prefer to say that things that we didn't think were connected. After looking at some things, we have to consider that they might be connected. So this is a passage that I go back to again and again whenever I ask myself, what are you doing? And I think that it is the side of me that some of you know from having heard me before is close to that line of Hegel's where it says, oh, your theories don't match up with the facts. And the answer was, well, so much the worse for the facts. Here, I just want to say, oh, I just want to say that they might be connected. And so I think it's tacit in the motivation of this workshop on grammar wars. And what to consider, what is it that grammar might be connected to other than what we have considered previously? And we've had a whole number of things listed about theology, about political things, about theological disagreements, about the superiority of one religion versus another. So all of these things are what might be connected. So what I'm going to do with the time that I'll be speaking is to look at a relatively small scale question of how many vowel sounds there are in two different languages in early medieval Sri Lanka. One of them, the question about how many vowel sounds there are in the Pali language, was one that was the subject of at least a debate, if not a war. And what I find interesting is that this small debate over how many vowel sounds there are in these different languages actually suggests some possible large-scale connections that are going on. So the point of looking at the debate is not for anything about the internal dynamics of the debate, but what else is brought into view. I have to give something of an explanation of some words that would be key to what I'm talking about. Words that are about language, the names of language. And so the two that are really crucial, one will be quite familiar to many people, and that is Pali. And the other is probably less familiar to people, but for some already know, and that is Elu. So let me just explain what those refer to, because they're not, strictly speaking, obvious when you say how many vowel sounds there are in Pali, because you might think, oh, what that implies is that we're talking about a language, and we're not. So that the word Pali in the Pali language refers to the Pali canon of the collected books that are of things that are attributed to what the Buddha said. And so that is the Pali. And then the language that is in the Pali is referred to as the Pali language. And so we have taken the Pali language and used Pali as a proper name of a language, when it's actually the proper name of a canon. And then when we want to refer to the language, we can say, well, we're referring to the Pali language, or in the time period I'm talking about, where regionalization of language occurs quite often,
it's referred to as Magadhi, as a part of India that people have no connection to at the time that they're talking about that language. And they talk about people in that area are speaking this language when they're not. It's like saying that in London, people are still talking Anglo-Saxon. And you would say, well, there's some Anglo-Saxon there, maybe, it's not what is happening. So what you have is a whole series of grammatical works that are written on the language of the poet. And so in that is something that we've seen already on Aristarchus writing about the grammar of Homer, and then Duran writing about the grammar of the Hebrew Bible. And so what is a really interesting feature that has come up is grammar is maybe about language, but it may be about a certain kind of language that is only known in a literized way already. That is not something that you're referring to other people speak and how do we kind of make sense of it. And that this kind of comes back to the discussion that Sivan and Ursula were having, that in order to have grammar, perhaps you need to have literature. You need to have something written that would make sense of it. Now, Elu, like Pali, has double meanings. One meaning of the word Elu is that it's referring to the most ancient form of the singular language. And that then it could be referred to sometimes to say that it is a singular Prakrit. It is the spoken language of a region that developed into a written language later on that today is known as Sanskrit. Say that in this was a room in Colombo, we referred to use the word singular Prakrit instead of saying singular is a political statement. Because it's to indicate that there may not be direct continuity between what was then and what is now, but that there was sufficient change that we can refer to two different languages. But you could also say that the language of singular Prakrit, or Elu, is not intelligible to any speaker of singular today, and it wasn't intelligible to singular speakers, say, in the 15th century, without some education. So that one of the great poems of the 15th century written in Elu begins by saying, don't be discouraged because this is in Elu. And so what it is maybe like for some of us when we go to play Shakespeare, at first we're not able to understand what's being said, but gradually we get into understanding. The idea that a poet in the 15th century could be writing in what is Old Singular, calling it Elu, indicates the second meaning. And what Elu is referring to is the name of the singular that is used in poetry. And this is a language that has a great deal of persistence, conservativeness, purism, all kinds of terms, that it has a relative sense of stability to it. There's a problem on this simply because the language is changing around it, so it becomes increasingly archaic compared to other people. So, explain the larger language system, Elu. So we can see that it's common for talking about languages in South Asia to refer to them as being diglossic. You have a spoken form and then a written form. Singular is diglossic. But then what happens is that the written form is diglossic itself. And so then I think that you have a written form that would include both Elu and something called mixed singular, Misla singular. Another name that would be quite useful for it might be Manipravala. It is a singular that's using Sanskrit vocabulary with singular grammar. And so everything that Sivan was just talking about with Malayalam fits into a written singular that is just used mainly in prose, Misla singular. Then you have a poetic singular that is elu, that is marked really quite differently in terms of how it sounds. And this is a singular, let's Sanskrit in, Sanskrit words. Elu has a restricted alphabet that prevents all kinds of sounds in Sanskrit to be entered into the use of elu. There are no aspirates in it. So all kinds of words that are just ordinary. And this sort of singular can't be used in elu, just to indicate what the creative potentials that this would make possible. Is that someone in this listing would use the Sanskrit word dharma with all of the different meanings that the Sanskrit word does. You could use a loan word, tatsama, from Pali, dhamma, which would stand out as Pali, not singular, and could use the elu word, dham. You could use all three words in one sentence with slightly different effects, slightly different connotations. So that to have this kind of range of possibility. And then you always are having spoken singular, that's like any language changing, that can also be referred to. Well, this is legitimate because people say X. That is like what Sivan was supposed to say. So written singular is diglossic. And then elu is also diglossic, in which you have a form that is good, and then another form that is less good. And that comes from Dungan's distinction between style of Vaidarbhi, which is put into elu as good. It says only the Vaidarbhi, the simple style. I'm trying to think of another way of describing Vaidarbhi. Where it says the Gaudi style of Baroque is declared to be less good. And that less good usually is bad. So, but it allows it sometimes, it has a place. People who are English speakers say that what's happening here is something that's like in English between Latin vocabulary and Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. How the two combine in different kinds of Englishes. Now, one of the things that is that what I want to talk about is put into a large frame before turning to something small. And I just want to remind all of us, because it's been in the background from first session from Isaac Ham's really interesting Latin and Romance languages, that for all of us thinking about South Asia, that what's immediately at fore is the theory of the vernacular millennium, and that the power of that theory was it was meant to apply to Europe as well as to South Asia. So that the coincidence of timing of the development of what in South Asian context we would say, or the development of the recognition of Deshi local languages in literature is taking place in South Asia at the same time as various kinds of Romance languages that are appearing in Europe. And just on the general theory of Pollux is that something's happening in history, choosing to create a written literature along with its complement of political discourse in local languages is happening in a very large area. And just on like the economy of explanation, if you can have one explanation that will explain things, it's better than having 50 or having 2. So that's just part of the power of theory. One of the things that is happening is that in the general theory of vernacular millennium of producing local languages, what I would say is particularly interesting theoretically about Sri Lanka is that it doesn't fit into the general theory. It doesn't fit into the general theory in two ways. One is that Sanskrit is not used in Sri Lanka for political discourse. And that is just an anomaly that is part of policy. For me, the other thing that is important is that in Sri Lanka, you have this language Pali that is being used for a long time for learning purposes. And within the theory of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, Pali doesn't show up.
Okay.
It's not one of the languages. It's not a Deshi, but not a local language either. And so that feature of this language that doesn't fit into any categories becomes something to pay attention and to see what it says about the relationships to the other languages that are operating in the processes of the vernacular millennium. Now, one other thing I just want to point out is that there's one of the characteristics of the vernacular millennium is that it's a time of linguistic and literary change. And people have a sense of doing something that hasn't been done before. And doing things in ways that say not allowed to do that. And that kind of sense of we're doing something new that other people are not so sure about what we're doing. One of the interesting things, especially listening to Sivan, the discussion on the Līlātilakam, which the stuff I'm talking about in Sri Lanka is part of the same process that Sivan is talking about. It's how they interconnected because there's migrations coming from Kerala to Sri Lanka during this period. But that the Sri Lankan stuff is slightly early. And it has a different contour than anything that Sivan was, we don't see what Sivan was describing. The difference is that the discussions about what are we doing here are about, and we might say the war is against a possible future and a possible future of destruction. And so what is the main concern is how do we prevent destruction? Pali, the stuff on Pali is easier to see. To recall that people are writing grammars to understand the language of the Pali, which is being put into, if you understand the language of the text, you'll be able to understand the message that is in it. You'll be able to practice it, and you'll be able to accomplish it in terms of realization and awakening. If you misunderstand it, it's to destroy the possibilities of awakening. And the Buddha did predict that his teaching was going to decline. And so the misunderstanding of words was a sign it's gone. And if it's in the words, then the realization is further ahead, that if we're getting things wrong. So that part of the concern is that the study of grammar, arguments over grammar is, can we make sure that we're getting the intention? The curious way, in singular, you have a similar kind of concern about warding off potential decline. It's not like what we just saw with the Līlātilakam of, can we describe what's going on? It's like we're afraid of what might happen. So in a book that is a translation of Dundan's Mirror of Literature, the Līlātilakam, Poetics for Our Own Language, there's a very interesting place where Dundan in his work is concerned about unintentional vulgarity. And he gives examples of how, you could mishear something and it would be a vulgarity. The author of Poetics for Our Own Language refuses to give an example in which he just says, unlike Sanskrit, which is akaliko, is eternal, singular, our language is kalika, exists in history. And so something that is vulgar now, through usage, could become acceptable. Now, just to see, this is an insightful, real point. There's a time in my life when my children were young, they were learning how to use vulgarities on school playgrounds. And at home, they would say, "This sucks." And I said to them one time when we were going to see their grandmother, "Don't say the word sucks in front of your grandmother." And they said, "Why not?" And I said, "She'll feel bad that her grandchildren are using that word. She thinks it's a word that people shouldn't say." And they said, "Okay, good." And they were really careful not to do it. But one time they're there with her, and something happens, she goes, "This really sucks." And you just could say that, between when I was a child and had my mouth flushed out with soap, and when my children appeared, the language has changed. And the vulgarity that went with this word sucked had gone away. And so you can just say, the author of Poetics for Our Own Language was aware of that. But that comment that he's making is bad stuff can happen if we're not doing it. But I just want to emphasize this, the concern of here, in some sense, is grammar is about fighting off the natural processes of decline. It's a way of trying to stem it, slow it down, to take care of things that we've inherited. Now, let me just, because I'm going to come back to this later on. One line, an important thing in Dundon's Mirror of Literature says, and it may be connected to decline, that correctly used language, go, as the wise say, is indeed a wish-granting cow. But when it is used wrongly, it only reveals the user as bovine, right? And so there's a lot of puns in it and double in that. But just that, I want to remind us of. But you can see that it's also pointing about how bovine uses could become acceptable. And that would be a disaster. Because to say one thing that again on the poly ones, because they're more pronounced. They explicitly said that not pronouncing right and thus misperceiving meaning leads to the confusion and disappearance of the Buddhist teaching. And so that this is contributing to something that is essential to human life, to leaving the Now, interesting things historically is that Buddhists in Sri Lanka for at least half a millennium, probably longer, were paying a lot of careful attention to the Pali, interpreting it, without producing any kind of standardized, systematic grammar. When we look in the commentaries, the grammatical explanations seem to be really quite ad hoc. And sometimes the questions are, does this comment reflect knowledge of economy? But lots of times we say, they're just making up stuff, trying to make sense of usages in the text, the way that I might try to make sense of English, but not really competent to do. So the first independent grammar of the language of the Pali was written by a man named Kachayana in South India around the 7th century. I actually think that location and time is significant. That is pretty close to redundant. And we can say, oh, the vernacular millennium. The conditions for the vernacular millennium are being set into motion before the vernaculars are using them. So Dundon, I think, is unleashing the possibilities of the vernacular millennium, even though it's an open question of did he know what he was doing? Right? Say something's happening with this first independent grammar in Pali by Kachai. Just to repeat, what is earlier is not systematized. But here, we just are going through a basic. The opening sutra is this Atto Akara Sanyato. A little bit opaque. We can say what it is meaning artha is from and something with sanya. So the cognition, the perception, the understanding, the recognition of akara, which then could be either the written letter or the sound. So just to show you the possibilities in Sri Lanka between Mithila Sinhala, Elu, and Pali. Sanya in Sanskrit is Sanya. And the Elu is Sanya. Now, the significance of this being the opening line of Kachai is that what it seems to have unleashed is that in the genre of writing grammars, the opening is on phonology. Not so phonology was something that was kept separate in Sanskrit grammars. A separate genre, Shiksha writing. But here it's put into grammar, the opening of it. One of the curiosities of it is, in this, it's very similar to Tolkappiyam. Tolkappiyam also begins with people. I'm not going to say any Tamil words in a room with Tamil. I've learned that I was trying to say the name of Līlātilakam. That's how you say it in Sinhala. So that does what the Elu chapters on phonology. One of the curiosities is that having grammars of Elu and a grammar of Sanskrit produced by a Sri Lankan monk, Dharmakirti, the Rupa Avatara, all begin with phonology. Tolkappiyam does, the Līlātilakam does. And these polygrammars are all beginning with phonology. So in a strange way, some pattern of grammatical formation is crossing at least 4 different languages. Tamil, Pali, Sinhala, and Sanskrit in Sri Lanka are all kind of conceptualizing grammar as beginning with phonology. Now, the first commentary on this Atto Akara Sanyato explains the sense of all speech is, it uses the same verbal form related to Sanya, is perceived, expressed, recognized, understood through sounds. When there is a mistake in sounds, there is a misunderstanding of meaning. Therefore, skill in sounds is a great help among the texts, the sutras, so that being able to recognize sounds, pronounce sounds, recite sounds, is being put out. This is where we begin. Now, also want to highlight the word in Tolkappiyam, Līlātilakam is different than what you have in the Sinhala, Pali, Sanskrit, and Rupa Avatara, but that they're all emphasizing something about this word, Sanya. the recognition or the expression that is using the same thing, and the other is the ambiguity of the word up. And it could be orthography, or it could be like pronunciation. And so, and both of those things seem to be in play because there's certain sounds that can be written differently. One that's most common, how do you write an anuswara? The different ways of writing it. And so what you have in this context is that ritually, the same words that are pronounced the same way are read twice because they're written in different ways. So when you say Buddham Saranam Gacchami, I go to refuge for the Buddha, the anuswara can be written in two different ways. So because you're writing it in two different ways, you have to say it in two different ways, even though it doesn't sound different at all. And so this is, you say, well, pronunciation doesn't count for everything that is going on. Now, maybe to make one general comment that would be important, and that is that pronunciation, this care about pronunciation excessively at times is just a place of calling attention to language, being self-conscious about that. And it will be, something that is in a place where multiple languages are being used, that how people are pronouncing the same language is differently is very obvious. Those of you who studied Pali, and then with people who are studying Pali, who read Pali in Thai script and are Thai speakers, they read Pali with tones. So it sounds completely different than anything in the way Sri Lanka. Now, here's the small debate. China in his grammar, he says that there are 41 aksharas in Pali. Another independent grammar written by someone named Moggallana in the 12th century in Sri Lanka says that there's 43. That's the debate. 41, 43. And it all comes down to the number of vowels and whether or not there is a short version of E and a short version of O.
There is.
Now, let me just point out that a commentary on Kachayana said that anyone who says that there's more than 41 is not Buddha. It's not. It's destroying the teaching of the Buddha. And since you are, we know whatever, I'm not surprised. No.
Satanic vowels.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why this is kind of a real issue is because theoretically, by Pali phonology, there has to be a short E and a short O. And that is because what people studying Pali, in the first class, what you're taught is something called the law of more. That in Pali, any syllable cannot have more than 3 mores, 3 beats. So any syllable that has 2 consonants, and that would be 2 beats, and has a long vowel, which would be 2 beats in itself, the vowel has to be shortened. And so that in A, I, and U, the spelling is changed. But in E and O, the spelling is not changed. And it's a question of sound. So it has to be that it is there, even though
No graphic representation, yeah.
Well, in singular, there's graphic representation, but that is not used in Pali. And
How old is the graphic representation? You find it in the inscriptions, or could it be a consequence of 19th century script reform?
so the question would be that, say, in the writing of Pali, so that the possibility of having a short E was there, but people didn't do it. And so it wasn't that, so
Just a question, coming from someone with zero knowledge of Pali or Indian.
you're talking about you or me?
But it's more of a linguistic question, or a personality thing, is if, as you say, that the reason we know that happens in short, even O, is because of the oral rule. If I'm understanding correctly, doesn't that just mean that the long and short vowels are allophones of each other, or are they actually
So
just
this
phonetically?
this is the issue. Are they just allophones, or is there something else of a greater significance? So that people who are historical linguists of Pali always say these are mere allophones. For the debate, they were not mere allophones, because if you mispronounce the ritual, it was declared to be invalid. So you can say that in American marriage ceremonies, where if you might say, if you take so-and-so, and if you say, if you fake so-and-so, you would say it's invalid. And so that's one of the things that you just say, oh, that it was just this ritual sense that the mispronunciation in a ritual made the ritual invalid. And so linguistically, they are mere allophones.
Just those two short vowels, or all five, or there are more than five? I don't know.
So the other ones, you would say, oh, you're making a spelling mistake. And for people reading Pali, it's like you have to learn that, oh, that I have to count the consonants that are in the syllable, because this may actually be a long A here, but because of the consonant combinations, it has to be written as a short A. And so it would be a certain kind of sandhi that exists in Pali that is just simply based on phonology. Well, you have a question.
Well, does the law of Mora have exceptions like every law?
Yeah, it does. But, and so, but the exceptions are in long words.
In
long words.
Long words, okay.
So that's one of the interesting places, like the word like Brahmana ends up being an exception simply because everyone's using this word Brahmana all the time, and the Pali word is Bhamana. That you like stick in the R because it just sounds. No, just say what it is a kind of surprise. So Kachayana says there's 8 vowels. And Moggallana says that there's 10. And what you have with Moggallana is there's 5 short, 5 long. And when we go to this other grammar written about the same time of Eru, a word called Compendium of Words and Their Meanings, Siddha Sangara. Second thing is that it also says that Eru has 10 vowels, 5 short, 5 long, which in it is the language used in that text. It has more than 10 vowels. So it ignores one of the most distinctive vowel in Eru, something called E. So that when it's transliterated, next we'll try to systematize and say, oh, it's being, the A is being treated as diphthong, and therefore it's not really counting as a vowel, but it's just usually considered to be a vowel. Usually it's to say, what makes us singular? No one else in South Asia has that vowel. We do. So, now, yeah, they think, I guess David Shulman about this. About how many vowels is in Tokai? One way of counting it is 12. But Wikipedia, the source of all authoritative knowledge, says 10. And then David said, oh, 10 simple. Then something, but it's just, for me, it's past enough of a puzzle. Why is it that Moggallana has 10 vowels and no one else had it before? And you say, well, we just recognize that there's a vowel there that's different in pronunciation because of the law of Mora. Why is it that Siddha Sangara has 10 vowels when it definitely knows that there's more sounds? And then this is one of the things that I just want to suggest. The number 10 is connected to the 10 gunas. And the name for vowels in Siddha Sangara, that's from prana. Prana is what the poetics for our own language in translating into singular calls the 10 gunas. Yes. So in the metaphor of these are the breaths that animate the body in poetry. And the same thing, the vowels are the breaths that are animating the body of the consonants. So a similar kind of metaphor. Now, Moggallana and everyone debating this gives 3 examples of a short eating based on words that are in the canon. Say better. Lip. And also camel.
Camel.
Ushtra.
Ushtra.
Or pickup.
And then Soti, which is swastika. Right. Only there's lots of examples that could have been chosen. These 3. And in the discussion of it, only these 2 that keep on coming up. Now, double meaning of the Oto will come back. I want to point out for myself as a student of Pali, studying Pali, this one is not a problem. It doesn't fit into what Moggallana is saying, simply because of syllable division. Syllable divide here. So here we have the problem. One consonant, one, another consonant. Therefore, the E, which would be 2, has to be 1. Here we have the same problem. One consonant, another consonant. The O that is 2 has to be 1, has to be pronounced as 1. But here, you don't have the problem. That O is 2 plus consonant is 3. No problem. It can be pronounced wrong. So that's the examples in which you would just say, oh, this one creates a problem. What's going on? And no one says there's a problem. And one of the things I just want to point out is that in the reception of this debate, great single poet, Līlātilakam, who was also a great scholar of knowledge. He locates the debate, the significance of the debate, as being in ritual terms. That mispronunciation invalidates the ritual. And the extreme example to connect it would be the ordination rituals where you have to repeat twice the same sounds because they're written differently. You're just trying to be careful about pronouncing. Alistair Boynall, who's the person who started talking about this debate first, connects it to, it's about regional identities formed between people in South India. The China school is associated with South India, Mogalana is associated with Lanka, and so that's also part of it. I want to connect it to one other kind of thing, and this is where I'm glad that Gary Tubb is here. So it comes back to a question: is this more than just mere allophonies? So in a really striking essay by Gary, published by Gary, that's called Abhinavagupta on Phonetic Texture, which is like an inspired reading of Abhinavagupta giving an inspired reading of Ramana. That the essay is about is something that what we see, and the discussion is within Ramana's discussion about guna. Gunas in the body of poetry work. What Gary points out is something that seems to be relevant to that the argument here is not connected to what modern linguists call as the law of mora, but is actually connected to consonant clusters. The issue here is consonant clusters, not the law of mora. So in the discussion of Shlesha, compactness as a guna, part of phonetic texture, what seems to be the case is that all questions about this, direct to Gary, is that consonant clusters after short vowels are conducive to phonetic compactness. So that, and then what this is connected to for Ramana is something that he starts to describe in terms that seem to be about melodiousness of how like the sound of the phonetic texture can be rising and falling by say the use of short vowels and longer vowels. And then the argument on this seems to be that the melody of the text is inherent in the text rather than devised by the reciter. That the phonetic texture belongs to the text itself and not to just the manner, the style of recitation. Now, for me, what this is reminding me of is the line of T.S. Eliot's that genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. And that line, genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood, seems to be like Kachayana. The meaning is from the comprehension, the perception of the sound. That something is happening.
Certainly the vowel doesn't mean that consonant but it's often determined by exactly that same thing in Arabic and Latin sometimes.
This may well be, because say for 1,000 years, people studying Pali, writing Pali, didn't care about it. But all of a sudden they started to care about it. And they started to kind of have a theory of it that didn't match the way that they were using the language before, in which the perception of consonant clusters in this way wasn't something that was kind of thematized. The way the commentaries were treating the spelling of the poem. So This is the small point is connected to a really large scale point for me. And that has to do with in the vernacular millennia, the relationship in Sri Lankan literary cultures between three languages. And comes back to Pali. Where is Pali in the vernacular millennia? It's being turned into a vernacular when it is also not a Deshi, not a local language. The basic article is, the strong version of Elu was resistant to the superimposition of things from Sanskrit onto singular poetry. But the theories of literature were emphasizing an excellent author could write, should be able to write in multiple registers, multiple styles, by Darby and Gaudium. But that was not permissible in Sanskrit. So then what we would have is the strong push of Elu against Sanskrit backwash into Pali. And one of the interesting things is that in Poetics for This Language Around, the phenomenon of compactness, Schleisha, is said to just naturally occur in Singla. Or another way of taking it, it never occurs in Singla. And when it deals with that guna, it leaves it out. And so then you would just say, but people know the phenomenon exists. They want to write in it. And so people are writing literature in Pali, not just the grammar of the Pali, but writing literature in Pali. And this feature now becomes Pali literature should be, we need to have the short E and the O for literature. It's not, we don't need it for the canon. We need it as a potential for writing and literature. Let me just finish and just say, well, these are what might be, going back to Freud, what might be connected. One small point that matters for the 5 of us in the universe who are concerned about the history of literary theory in Sri Lanka in the 12th, 13th century, is that Vamana was known in Sri Lanka at this time. Book may not be there, but people knew stuff about Vamana. And we know that people were aware of Abhinavagupta and Kashmir, even if we don't know they have a book. And so they may have been something connected to Abhinava's reading of Vamana. Second, that the history of literature in Pali needs to be understood by connecting it to the history of literary culture, singular literary culture. That this debate over the vowel sounds in Pali is triggered by something happening in Sanskrit. It's not about Pali. The other is the argument about ritual. Backwash into things about poetry. It's a much larger thing of the kind of common connection between poetry and ritual that we see in so many places. And the theorization about grammar or literary language and things showing up in ritual. We're not surprised that it goes there. And then the last, I'm just kind of a striking thing. And Modius makes a case about the Vira Solium or Vira Cholium, that it needs to be understood as both Tamil and Buddhist. That you need to look at it. You need to say all of these works need to be understood in these double perspectives, instead of saying, oh, the Pali works, they're clearly Buddhist. Instead, they're relating to things that are not necessarily Buddhist. And then the kind of the larger thing is just how integrated all of these discussions about a very minor issue, say, is connected to very large scale issues about the possibility of literature at this time in different countries.
Just a clarification question. Was it in Moggalayan's grammar that you said that the 10 vowels were referred to as the 10 breaths?
No, it's the 10, but in Siddhasangana, so the grammar, vowels are referred to it. The name for vowels is breath. And so the 10 vowels there are just called 10 breaths. For me, there was just an interesting resonance connection that translation of Duncan when it takes off the 10 gunas, calls them breaths. So it sounds like that the gunas are to the body of kavya in the way that vowels are to the body of language. And that there's something that they animate.
But just to make sure credit is given where it's due, I think the Siddhasangana perhaps got it from the Tolkapia, where the vowels are called the breath syllables and the consonants are called the body syllables.
But it's also in Dundan
Let me just
itself.
say that
The Tolkapia was before that.
Yeah, but he's working with Dundan.
He's talking about syllables.
No, but then,
Siddhasangana.
yeah.
Let me just say though, saying that the Siddhasangara got it from Tolkapia, I'm going to quote you, and I recommend you don't go to
So you answered at the beginning one of the questions I was also wondering about during Sivan's talk in my ignorance about the origins of the names for these languages. And I find that interesting because the names for languages often encode assumptions or ideologies about those languages. And I was wondering about Sinhala, because you explained Pali, but what actually is Sinhala? Is it the name for people or place or canon? And where does it fit in with this bigger picture? Is it an umbrella term for this entire system or parts of the system? And then the second part is you mentioned in passing a word for loan word at the beginning. And I was wondering what that actually means, partly because according to the Līlātilakam, if I understood correctly, loans don't exist, at least between these local languages. And also because this word loan word that we use is just so comically inappropriate, because you don't actually borrow words with the intention of giving them back. I mean, it's just a bad concept, I think. So yeah, those are my two questions.
So this is a place where the names for the languages that are here, in the text that we're using, what you say, you don't have a direct name for the language anywhere, except something emerges. So you can't refer to the language without referring to something else. So, but what's interesting is that what's striking is that Līlātilakam and then this text Siddhasangara, and also poetics, where you have poetics for this language allows. So that the name of the language is this language allows, aroma. And so it doesn't have a name except that it's this language allows. Then you could refer to it as the language of the island. And that island is sometimes called Sinhala. Now, what that word means at this time is the center of a very, very heated political debate. And today, the word Sinhala refers to the name of the ethnic. It seems at that time it may have been referred to only the ruling family who ruled over the island. And so the island of the Sinhala was not the ethnic group, but through the rulers of, it would be like referring to Russia as the country of the Romans. That you didn't have a name for it, it was just the country of the Romans. And then an Elu is the Elu form of Sinhala. So and sometimes it is given as Palo, which is Sinhala, closer to Sinhala. So, But what you can see is that Elu doesn't despises consonant clusters. It doesn't have consonant clusters. Or it kind of, but it's taking a loan word, and tatsama it simply means equivalent to that. And then there's another one, tadbaba, that would be analogous to
Originating from that.
Yeah.
originate.
Yeah, it's important just to, can I make a note of that? I refer you all to the book, The Language of the Snakes by Andrew Ollett, which theorizes or explains how Prakrit is a theory of movement of linguistic items from Sanskrit to other languages, all clustered under Prakrit, and many of the vernacular languages of India are fall under that notional category. So it's not loan words between any language and any language, but words that are either equivalent to the words in Sanskrit or originate from the words in Sanskrit.
And this exists in Līlātilakam. This is
Yeah,
well
yes.
accepted in Līlātilakam. It's a different.
And then you have, say, Siddha Sangara, words that are unique to Sanskrit. That would be.
Yeah, in all of the Prakrits. Yes, yeah.
Question, which is, so you were mentioning that there was this anxiety that the decolonization and the correct pronunciation will be lost and affect the ritual success. But was there also this concern over how words' meaning would change over time? I mean, that's also a huge, because that happens all the time. So were texts produced to, like, were there dictionaries or was there an attempt to do that as well?
Not for Elu, but for Pali, it is one of the standard services of a content. Right? It's just going through giving all basically dictionary words. The word comes up and gives all kinds of meanings that are there, and then says, in this place, these three meanings are. And so it's not quite historical, but it's catching that. Just say one thing I'd come back to. These three examples. That's what I think is really incredibly important because of the double meaning of written. And when they're going through pronunciations and how pronunciation works, and they're naming, different sounds come from where the mouth is shaped, and some of it has to do with, in English, we would call it labial. It's the word. The very example is referring to, and then it has this double meaning, depending on which Sanskrit word is behind it, as either lip or bison or camel. Camels have big lips. One of the things that I think in it is that it's an allusion to the line of Gandhi about the misuse of language, the results are only bovine. And we have with the Oto and cattle is that they're both domesticated growing. So what you would have just is one thing that the proper use, what does you get? Say better. What do you get? So happiness. Possibility is it can be
we got completed with this. It's a stupid question. I was just struck by your explanation of the origins of this language. The phrases of autonomy. So it's the language, it's this language of people from area ruling class and so on. So languages don't have their own names. Why is that? Is that due to a theology about ontology about languages? Is that don't really exist? ineffable. And I was thinking about, modern languages, Western languages, French, German, and so on. I mean, those do seem to be prior to the countries. Right?
The names?
In German, there are many German-speaking people not in Germany. Right? Or what?
It wasn't called that. It wasn't called that.
Yeah, no, that's reasonable. It's Deutsch. Deutsch. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's going on here? Whether this is, whether the articulate, it's a reflex of some view, conception about what a language is, or is there some simple explanation? I don't know.
I don't have. I don't have any answers to it all. Many languages in the world, especially spoken language, oral tradition, call that language.
My grandmother, whose language was Yiddish, thought that there was no such language, and she called it jargon, kind of miscellaneous blend of things. When I wanted to learn Yiddish, I told her I was trying to learn this language. She was surprised that anybody would want to learn this jargon, even though she loved it. Yeah, like her. Yeah. She loved the language. But,
And there's beautiful literature in this language,
Yeah.
jargon.
yeah.
I want to go back to the Otto. It makes sense that you would need the short vowels for poetry, because the difference between short and long is clearly audible, and obviously it will have an impact.
Yeah.
What's not quite as clear to begin with is why it would not also make a difference in terms of the validity of a pronunciation.
It does.
And well, sure, if you actually do it wrong, but what I'm thinking of is,
But my guess is that the word auto doesn't show up in any ritual.
well, that's an important word, because aside from probably small number of words like this, I think what you're getting at is that the actual pronunciation of the word is automatically generated from within the language, because the law of the mora does in fact apply. But what I find really interesting, in fact startled me to see you present this by saying it's a matter of syllable division, because of course acoustically it is, but in Sanskrit theory, constantly syllable division is completely ignored. And so if you have a word like tantra, the first syllable is in fact heavy, and that's because you pronounce it done. And you can do that because the next syllable, tra, you can start a syllable in isolation in Sanskrit with the tr, but not with an ntr. So the problem arises if you take the n out and the word you're looking at is tatra, then you have the problem that you have in Latin, which I think was mentioned, that in Latin terms, traditional Latin terms, in English, it can either make position or not. But in Sanskrit, there's no option. In theory, it always makes position. The first syllable is always heavy, but the only way that can actually happen in practice is if the T is doubled. And so in fact, even though in Panini and in other systems, the doubling of the T is treated as optional, to my ear anyway, it's not optional at all in the actual pronunciation of people who speak fluent Sanskrit. No Shastri will ever pronounce that, unless he's speaking extremely quickly, and certainly within poetry would never pronounce it without doubling the T, even though it's not required. So what I'm leading up to here is I wonder, it seems to me that that's an issue in Sanskrit that simply doesn't come up in Pali, because the sound changes that are involved with consonant clusters automatically remove the situations in which the option might occur in Sanskrit. Am I right about that?
Yeah, but what you would have though is like an interesting situation where lots of the people who are, probably all of the people who are concerned with this debate know Sanskrit.
And have heard people speaking Sanskrit.
Yeah, and they speak Sanskrit themselves.
And so that all three languages are kind of in play. And what you're saying is another like kind of explanatory possibility is something that is kind of being extended from the world of Sanskrit into the world of Pali. Something's being extended from the larger world of Tolkapian and interest in phonology, recognizing phonology as part of the necessity of grammar, particularly connected to literature. Things about things that are happening in singular stuff. But it's just a kind of debate that if you were just working over the language of the Pali, I don't think that it rises to the surface as being worthy of a debate. The debate seems to be prompted by something. And this is a word that I love that I learned from Joseph yesterday, Seguro, that just say, or consignificance, that what we're talking about here is something that may be in the realm of Seguros of Pali, but have great significance in the larger context, but are not of primary significance in Pali, in the language of the Pali. And for 1,000 years, people spoke about the language of the Pali without having to notice this.
And when they write grammars, do they in fact talk about syllable division?
Well, that's the thing that I have to ask someone who knows something. So I'll ask Alistair Barnall. But everyone, the first lesson of teaching Pali, learning Pali is syllable.
Yeah. Well, what underpins that is interesting to me. The example of Abhinavagupta that you gave, that's not based on theory at all, because he's not even actually commenting on what he claims to be commenting on. He's commenting on a completely different text. But more importantly, he notices things that nobody else has ever noticed, even after he described it. Either they didn't understand what he was saying, or they didn't agree with it. So when you talk about T.S. Eliot and how something communicates before it's understood, it doesn't really apply to Abhinavagupta for two reasons. And one is that he seems to have been aware of various kinds of impacts using a sensitivity that other people just don't have. And the second reason is you can't find an example where he didn't understand the thing the first time he heard it. So it's a good concept, but it doesn't apply to him.
This is one thing that I think that in the Sri Lankan case, some of the significance of this debate, people who commented on it later, I don't think saw the full significance of it, like with Abhinavagupta, that they said it's of importance for ritual reasons, and not for other kinds of reasons that seem to be incorrect.
So that's on the level of David's Indra Shatra, really.
Yeah.
Which is, that's interesting in somewhat the same way, which is that people continue to talk about that centuries after the last time anyone heard anybody actually pronounce those things.
Yeah.
But Pani offers us a whole grammar of the tonal system, even though probably nobody was using it.
Perhaps they used it a little bit. Would you pronounce, if you said that you saw a crow, and you say I saw a black bird, and if you were speaking about the kind of bird that's a black bird, wouldn't there be difference in the stress pattern?
Stress pattern, but not the pitch.
So maybe it's a substitute.
It was. That's the standard.
It also makes a difference in whether it's just a bird that happens to be black, or whether it's a bird in the blackbird species.
Yes,
Which is
that's what he was saying.
Yeah, Krishna Sapa.
Maybe they still use the tones in Chinese time. It's possible.
Well, the interesting thing that happens in terms of whether it's theoretical or not is that you will hear people say nowadays, no, this word, that's not the word, this is not the word you think it is. It's made from a different suffix. You say, well, how do you know it's made from a different suffix? Because the accent produces a different accent. How do you know that it produces a different accent? Because it's made from that suffix instead of this. So there's a circularity there that's, and that's why they say, that's why there are all of these, that they say, pratigyananasik, that all of these pratigya things, that the Paninians have all these things that have been lost. They have them by hypothesis, meaning you have to reverse engineer it.
And also you only can learn it by oral teaching. And you
That's
need a
right.
teacher too. Yeah.
So then it raises the question of what is the actual, where do we get evidence on what the actual poetic impact of these things is? Are they basing it on a theory that they don't actually feel the effects of? Or are they talking about things that they feel and they want the theory to be brought up to date dimension?
Oh. I don't know if capable of looking at the poly that is produced at this time, the poetry produced at this time, which is, I made the argument that it's very much a lot of it is in a Gaudi style. But looking at it, looking for, trying to identify the features of the guru, whether we can see these, and that is like difficult to do. To say theoretically, one thing to say this is what compactness is. It's another thing to say, outside of an example that's provided to you, say here it is what you see. And so that one of the things would just be interesting to see where there's something like what, some cruder version of what Victor was talking about, short vowels followed by a consonant cluster is being exploited for some melodiousness of the language. One was I'm not confident, was I had like a teen ear. Just so that someone else, Nicholas Kummer or someone else would have been in a position to give examples of it. That I would say, well, that's another task to look at all of these independent poems written at this time and just paying attention to how the consonant cluster. It's just not being chosen by content.
But it's also difficult because it depends upon things that we may not be able to feel that people did feel, and we know that they did for Sanskrit, even people who are not like Abhinavagupta, because if you look at a big anthology like Subhashi Ratnakosha and you find 7 verses that seem almost identical in their wording, there has to be some difference that made it even worthwhile preserving, new reversions of poems that people already knew, and that has to depend upon value judgments that are not obvious to me. So I have to assume that people have detected things that I'm oblivious to.
That's impossible.
I said a short note because you've given us a really interesting example from something that has general application to most of what we've been talking about, right? I think we said the strong push of Elu against Sanskrit had a backlash in Pali.
Backwash.
Backwash. Okay, backwash. Okay.
These are all about the wars.
Yeah,
Comment
yeah,
on the
that's
difference. You have this large cap grammar wars. Mine is grammar peaceful connections.
But see,
I say backwash, you say backlash. So I think there's a difference in personality.
No doubt about that. But I think but the point I like to make is that whether we're talking about a dispute, a grammatical dispute, whether we're talking about something that might look very minute and localized or something much grander, they seem to arise in multilingual contexts. Nearly everything that we've heard over the last 3 days, and maybe in fact everything, beginning in the Akkadian world, seems to come from a kind of multilingual system. Diglossic, maybe multiply diglossic within the written and the form, but above all with the presence of some kind of important cultural presence of another language.
And that the categories that we have received that we use of influence and so on are just completely inadequate for what we have in front of us.
I'm just a bit concerned that, first of all, thank you, that was wonderful and very engaging and fascinating. And although I didn't fully come to a conclusion about the question of how many vowels, I was not sure. But I think I think I'm a bit concerned that we South Asianists are a little bit talking to ourselves and not always translating ourselves to non-South. I mean, we're used to it from everybody else, but that doesn't mean we should be doing the same. And so I just wanted to say something to comment on the question of naming of languages, that we're using all these names. But for us all, it's entirely clear that there are two categories at least of names for languages in South Asia. One category is names for languages that travel and are defined in connection with one another. So Sanskrit means the refined or the polished or the well put together language. And Prakrit means something like the natural, okay? That is it. Again, we can speak for hours about the exact shades of meaning here, but these are languages whose names mean nothing unless they have one another, okay? And Apabhramsha, which Sivan mentioned, means like deteriorated language, the fallen use of language. So this is one category of language. These are languages that travel and they are universal languages thought of, okay?
Translocal.
Translocal. Translocal. But there's a term for that. Languages off the road, margi, okay? And then there are local languages whose names eventually are defined by the community of their speakers who are usually localized. So Kerala Bhasha or Karnataka Bhasha or
What about
Bhasha.
Magadhi as the name for Pali? In
Wait. So there are exceptions. The exception, but these languages are okay. There are exceptions. Tamil, for example, is an interesting exception. Pali doesn't exactly work in the system. Pali, I mean Magadhi, as you said, but in this world, a name of a language usually appears within this already conceptualized system of language as being either traveling or localized. That doesn't mean that traveling language can't become localized, historically speaking, and vice versa, but that this theory engulfs the use and naming of languages and the practice of the way people think about the languages that they're using. That's very important. And that, I think, had to be clarified.
So in this sense, calling Tamil Chola Bhasha and Pandya Bhasha is more than just, it's sort of like making it into something completely different than what.
But just that's what you just said is an important point, but the larger thing of the whole theory of the vernacular millennium, the premised on the inclusion of things in Europe. So that is just kind of a place where then adding in that within the vernacular millennium, then there's an issue about what happens to travel, what we call traveling languages, and so forth. So what happens to traveling languages, and whether in any particular place there's more than one of these traveling languages. And in South Asia, I'm not sure about in Europe, but you would have to say that Latin, Greek, Hebrew are all traveling languages in this sense. Then the place Joseph was talking about the interaction of three, which is the best traveling language, then you probably would have something analogous going on between Pali and Sanskrit. The claims that Pali is the original language, Mūla Bhāṣa, is, but people are comfortable saying that Sanskrit and Pali would be a couple.
Are there any cases where the language changes from being referred to by a term that belongs to the family of traveling language terms.
The family what?
In other words, are there any cases where a language changes from being referred to by a description that belongs to the traveling language family to being referred to by a term that belongs to the local fix?
I guess Magadi.
Do you understand my question?
But that's the other way around, right? This isn't Magadi is a localized region that becomes this kind of trans-Buddhist language. You're asking if there's a
If there's an actual change in terms. I was thinking, I mean, like, of what you were saying now is that, so for example, with Hebrew, I mean, it doesn't cease being called Hebrew, but it requires a sense of Lashon HaKodesh. Now, that would be a traveling, that would belong to the traveling language family. Okay. And I'm wondering whether there are examples where it goes from one family of terms to another. That's the language.
You know, if you're in Barcelona, that's the name for Spanish, right?
What does Latin mean?
So it refers to, well, yeah, I think Latium is originally a region.
Okay.
So Latinos, or yeah, Sermo Latinos is the language spoken in this particular region. Yeah.
So all the European languages are sort of place names.
Or
Well,
ethnic
people,
names.
yeah.
I'm missing something to Joseph's question. The two categories that you guys spoke about, the languages of the road and the languages of the region. I don't think you find historically the so-called languages of the road being identified as languages of the road. These are some kind of translocal languages, but they don't, because they are the prominent ones, they don't need a label. Whereas the regional languages are called regional, they are called the Deshi, Desha meaning region. So they are called the Deshi Bhashas. They refer to themselves as the Desha Bhashas or the Deshi Bhashas. But as far as I know, and others could say something, I don't think that the big prominent language, whether it's the Prakrit used by the Jainas or Sanskrit, speak of themselves as the language of the path or as the cosmopolitan language. I think that's something produced by scholarship.
The other category that was your first section, in the Latin was the rusticum, rusticum romano. That what you have is whether grammar wars will always go into either. I'm taking rusticum as being like Roman of the village, which has the meaning of log.
Country as opposed to city.
Very arbitrary points to you know, Dante's distinguishes between the lingua de oc and lingua de si. You know that? Those that use the word oc and then developing professionally, and then ones who say si. And that's his division of all the languages of Europe.
Yeah.
It's completely arbitrary.
We have to stop so that people can take the road or the language. So to Sivan and Charlie, a quick note. So tomorrow morning, the locals, the Deshi participants, please test yourself for COVID at home, the locals. The guests, you will be provided test kits here in the morning. Okay, so come a bit earlier so you can do the tests, and hopefully we're all negative as we've been.
So is the shuttle going to be asked to come earlier for us?
I can check that. What time does it usually come?
It's been coming at 8:30, but the traffic is terrible, so we don't get here significantly early.
Okay.
And it's on the schedule for 8:30 tomorrow.
Okay,
8:30?
I'll check that and I'll.
Oh, no,
Or
wait.
the shuttle?
Sorry, that's the PM show.
Hmm. We're starting 9 tomorrow?
I think we're starting at 9. Yeah, we're starting at 9 and the shuttle hasn't come in